The Vatican's biggest fear was not a war or a rebellion, but a Bible older than Rome, bound in silence and filled with forbidden texts. It came from the mountains of Ethiopia, carrying stories the Church had buried and truths it could not control. Inside its pages were Gospels the West had erased, names the Vatican never dared to speak, and a version of history carved in stone, not rewritten in councils. These are not legends. They are records sealed in hidden vaults where secrets still breathe. Tonight we step into the shadows of history. If you enjoy secrets like this, be sure to subscribe. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the story unfold. It arrived in silence without announcement or ceremony, wrapped in thick cloth and sealed in wax. The crate had no markings except for a single line in faded ink, barely legible beneath the dust of time. Inside was a book that should not exist, not because it was fake, but because it was true, too true, and that truth did not fit the version of history the Vatican had worked so carefully to preserve. The man who opened it was a Jesuit scholar named Father Luca, quiet and precise, known for his devotion to the preservation of sacred texts. He had spent most of his life in the cold reading rooms beneath the Apostolic Palace, cataloguing forgotten manuscripts, but nothing had prepared him for this. The parchment inside the crate was centuries old, yet preserved almost perfectly. The binding was strange, made from a material he could not name, but it was the language that first unsettled him. Gears, the ancient tongue of Ethiopia, known to only a handful of living scholars. As he turned the pages, his hands began to tremble. The first shock was the order of the books. Genesis was there, but it was not the beginning. Before it, another story, the Book of Enoch, a text the Vatican had rejected for centuries. It told of angels who fell from heaven, of forbidden unions, of watchers who taught mankind's secrets never meant to be known. Father Luca had seen references to it before, scattered across marginia and apocryphal lists, but he had never seen it in full, not like this. And then came the second twist, not just Enoch, but Jubilees, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Book of Tobit, the Gospel of Mary, stories the Western Church had erased, scrubbed from its canon after the councils of Carthage and Nika, yet here they were, not hidden in some private library, but openly bound together as scripture. In Ethiopia, this was the Bible, not a collection of stray writings, but a sacred, complete testimony. Father Luca closed the book and locked the door behind him. He did not sleep that night. He did not even pray. He wrote a single sentence in his private journal, a habit he had kept since he was a young seminarian. It read, simply, "This changes everything." Within 48 hours, the manuscript was sealed again and taken into the lower levels of the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Not destroyed, not denied, simply hidden. As if placing it behind locked, iron doors would make its words easier to forget. But not everyone forgot. A few within the Cura whispered that Father Luca had gone missing the following year. Others claimed he was transferred quietly to a monastery in the Alps. No one ever confirmed where. And the book, though never catalogued, is still said to remain inside the Vatican walls, waiting not because it is dangerous, but because it tells a story the Church cannot explain. A story older than Rome, a Bible written in shadows and believed still by millions. The rain had been falling since sundown. It was not the kind of storm that crashes and shouts, but the quiet kind, the kind that makes the stones of the Vatican seem to breathe. The guards at the bronze doors shifted in their coats, glancing only once as a small cart rolled across the courtyard, its wheels echoing against the wet marble. Atop it, covered in thick tarpaulin and tied with rope, was a single wooden crate. No escort, no fanfare, just one man pushing the cart, his face hidden beneath the hood of his coat. Inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive, the corridors were darker than usual. The oil lamps had burned low, casting long shadows along the walls. Only one light remained steady, deep in the restricted wing, where Father Luca sat in the receiving room. He had been told something rare was coming. He had not been told from where. The man with the cart said nothing. He simply placed a folder on the desk, nodded once, and disappeared back into the corridor. Father Luca opened the folder and found only a note. It was written in Latin with the papal seal pressed faintly into the paper. The handwriting was unfamiliar. It said, "For eyes only, not to be copied, not to be entered into the index." That was when he felt the first chill. The crate was heavy. It took him nearly half an hour to unseal it, his fingers slipping against the damp rope. The lid creaked as it opened, and at first he thought the crate was empty, but buried beneath layers of cloth and straw was a book unlike any he had seen. Not just old, but ancient, not just preserved, but revered. Wrapped in red silk and tied with a simple cord. When he pulled it free, the room changed. The air grew still, the silence heavier. Inside the book were letters he could not immediately read. The script danced across the pages, curved and beautiful, shaped by a language he had studied only briefly in his youth. GZ, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church. He turned to the center of the book. The story it told did not match, the one he had given his life to protect. Enoch walked among angels. Mary spoke not as a vessel, but as a prophet. There was no book of Revelation. Instead, there was something called the Apocalypse of Peter. The order of the canon was not just different, it was reversed. And tucked into the final page was something else. A letter unsealed, unfinished. It had no signature, only this line: "If this is true, then our foundation is built on sand." That night, Father Luca placed the book in the deepest chamber of the archive behind a gate no one used. He wrote nothing in the logs, no number, no name, only silence. And by morning, word had already spread to the congregation for the doctrine of the faith. The book was no longer just a manuscript. It was a threat. It is easy to believe that Rome was the beginning. The marble columns, the Latin prayers, the echo of footsteps in St. Peter's Basilica all tell the story of a church built at the center of the world. But what if the center was never Rome? What if the oldest Christian? Stories live not beneath Italian stone, but in the highlands of Africa. Long before the Vatican rose to power, long before the first popes were crowned, the people of Ethiopia were already writing their own sacred history. They did not borrow it from the West. They carried it with them, carved into stone churches, painted on parchment with colors made from crushed flowers, and whispered in a language the Roman Church could not fully understand. The Ethiopian Bible is older than the Latin Vulgate. It is older than the official canon confirmed by any council. And it holds more books, dozens more, not fragments or folk tales, but complete texts, preserved, protected, and read aloud for centuries. Some say it began with a royal gift, that when the Queen of Sheba visited King Solomon in Jerusalem, she returned to her kingdom not only with gold and wisdom, but with something far more powerful. She was pregnant with a child, Menelik, who would grow to become the first emperor of Ethiopia. That child would also bring with him the teachings of Israel, teachings that would become the foundation of a Christian faith untouched by European influence. But here lies the twist that troubled the Vatican. According to Ethiopian tradition, Menelik also brought home something else, a sacred object never meant to leave Jerusalem, the Ark of the Covenant. The Church in Rome called this impossible heresy, but they never sent anyone to verify it. Instead, they dismissed it in silence. Even as the Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept the Ark hidden in a guarded chapel where only one monk is allowed to see it for the rest of his life. That silence grew louder when Vatican scholars began comparing texts. The Ethiopian scriptures included stories left out of every Western Bible, writings that spoke of fallen angels, heavenly journeys, and a deeper role for women in early theology. These were not wild inventions. They were deeply rooted in tradition with lineages traced back to the earliest apostles. One scholar, Father Bellini, once remarked in a private letter, This is not a deviation from our history. This is a different history altogether. That letter was never published. When he died in 1968, the letter disappeared. There are rooms in the Vatican filled with books, but not all books are equal. Some are locked behind glass, some are never spoken of again. And then there are the books that make even the walls seem to whisper. This is not just a question of which Bible is older, it is a question of whose truth was preserved, and why the one that came from the mountains of Ethiopia, older than Rome and perhaps wiser than the West, was hidden away in the shadows of the Vatican. The pages were smooth, aged, and strangely warm to the touch. Father Luca ran his fingers over them carefully, as though the ink itself might still be alive. He had seen thousands of manuscripts in his years beneath the Vatican library, but none like this. This book did not whisper. It spoke. Each page in the Ethiopian Bible was hand-lettered in gaze with red and black ink dancing between delicate borders of gold leaf. The art alone would have placed it among the most treasured items in the Vatican collection. But it was not the beauty of the book that made Father Luca pause. It was what should not have been there. He turned to the first unusual entry with a slow breath. The Book of Enoch, a complete version, not a fragment, not a quotation tucked into another gospel, but the full account of angels who descended to earth, of forbidden knowledge given to men, of judgment carried out by forces outside the known heavens. The Roman Church had labeled Enoch heretical by the 4th century. And yet, here it was, sitting openly between Genesis and Exodus, as though it had always belonged. Further in there were more. The Book of Jubilees, the Book of Tobit, the Apocalypse of Peter, and then something else, a gospel with no name. It began with a woman's voice, calm, firm, and sorrowful. The writing suggested it was Mary herself, not as a quiet figure at the edges of the story, but as a witness, a teacher, a bearer of truths the apostles feared to carry. Father Luca's hands shook. These were not apocrypha. They were scripture, revered, and read aloud by millions of Ethiopian Christians for centuries. And yet the Church in Rome had spent just as long burying these same pages under layers of silence. The next morning, he brought a single photocopy of the gospel page to his superior Monsignor Diacross, a cold and calculating man known for protecting the Church from ideas that strayed too far. He said nothing as he read, but when he reached the words, "I saw the Son of Man clothed in light," and he wept for the world that would forget him, he tore the page in half and dropped it into the fireplace. "You did not see this," he said, "and if you speak of it again, you will not see this library either." Father Luca did not argue, but that night he wrote the gospel passage again from memory. Then he locked it inside a wooden box beneath his bed. 10 years later, that box was found unopened beside his body. There are pages in every sacred book that comfort us, and there are pages that disturb, but the ones that frighten the Vatican most are the ones that do both. Pages that speak, angels and women, of mysteries older than councils, and of a faith that once walked a different path. Pages that to this day the Church will not admit exist, but they do. The name Enoch barely appears in the Bible. Most of us know just a sentence or two, a whisper in the long lineage of Genesis. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more. That is all. No miracles, no sermons, just silence. But in the Ethiopian Bible, that silence ends. The Book of Enoch is not only preserved there, it is honored. It spans pages upon pages rich with visions, warnings, and secrets. In these writings, Enoch does not simply walk with God. He is taken beyond the sky, past the stars, into a realm where angels keep watch over the fate of the world. These angels are not soft and glowing, they are called the Watchers, and what they watched they were never meant to touch. According to the story, the Watchers were sent to guide humanity, to teach, to protect, to observe. But something changed. These angels looked upon the daughters of men and desired them. They broke the divine boundary and descended to earth. They took wives, they had children, and those children were giants, creatures of great size and strange knowledge. They taught humans how to shape weapons, mix potions, cast spells, read stars, and bend metal. They shared the secrets of the heavens. The world changed quickly, too quickly. The Vatican has never officially recognized this version of the story because if it is true, then some of what humans know did not come from divine inspiration or gradual discovery. It came from a rebellion among angels. When the Vatican first received a full copy of the Ethiopian Book of Enoch in the early 20th century, it was quietly sealed and filed under non-canonical studies. That was their way of saying not approved, without saying we are afraid of what it contains. But inside the secret halls of the Apostolic Archive, the name Enoch kept appearing in letters, in journals, in warning. One note, dated 1948, was written by a cardinal who had translated part of the book by hand. It read, "This text suggests a war in heaven before Genesis. If we admit this, then the creation story is not the beginning, it is the aftermath." A second twist came when scholars realized the Book of Enoch matched details from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered shortly after. Separate cultures, same story. The question was no longer whether the Watchers were real. It was why this story had been removed and who decided it was too dangerous to remain in the canon. In Ethiopia, they never removed it. The Watchers are still spoken of. Enoch is still honored. Their churches still sing his visions aloud during long glowing liturgies. But in Rome, the name Enoch remains a quiet warning, a figure too old, too bold, and too full of memory. His book tells of a time before time, a fall before the fall, and a truth the Vatican may still be trying to unwrite. Not because it is false, but because it never stopped being true. In the long corridors of the Vatican, where history is kept behind locked doors and silence, there is a story almost no one speaks of, not because it was forgotten, but because it was never meant to be remembered by the West. It begins not in Rome, but in Jerusalem during the time of King Solomon. Solomon, son of David, builder of the first temple, known for wisdom and wealth. The Bible tells us he ruled over Israel in peace. But in the highlands of Ethiopia, a different story is told, one that continues in the pages of a book the Vatican has always kept at a distance. According to the Kebra Nagast, a sacred Ethiopian text older than most Western historians will admit, the Queen of Sheba traveled to meet Solomon not just out of curiosity, but through divine guidance. She returned not only with gold and knowledge, but with a child. That child, Menelik, would become the first emperor of Ethiopia, and according to Ethiopian tradition, he carried something else with him. A secret the church in Rome still refuses to acknowledge. He carried Solomon's blood. That simple claim changes everything. If true, it would mean that Ethiopia, not Europe, holds the most direct royal line to the house of David, and it would mean that the divine right to rule, believed by medieval European kings to be passed through their own lines, may have already belonged to another nation, far from their courts and cathedrals. The twist came during the 13th century when Ethiopian priests brought copies of the Kabanagas to Jerusalem. According to letters stored deep within the Vatican archives, a Franciscan monk reported seeing the scrolls and immediately wrote to his superiors in Rome. In one surviving fragment, he wrote, "They claim Solomon's throne was never empty, only moved, and that the church sits in the wrong place." This was more than just a political problem. It was a theological one. If Ethiopia's emperors truly descended from Solomon, then they carried both royal and priestly authority. They were kings by blood and shepherds by God's will. That placed them above any crown in Europe, perhaps even above the Pope himself. Some within the Vatican dismissed the claim as legend, others were not so sure. A sealed report from the year 1915, written by a Jesuit missionary, described a ritual at the Ethiopian royal court involving a scroll wrapped in gold cloth. The missionary had been told it was part of the original blessing passed down from Solomon to Menelik. He was never allowed to see what was written on it. Within 5 years, that same missionary returned to Rome and left the order. Today, the Vatican rarely speaks of Solomon's line, but inside the Ethiopian Church, it is still honored. The bloodline is remembered not with titles or crowns, but with songs, chants, and stone-carved stories. And perhaps that is what troubles the Vatican most, that, far from Rome, in churches carved into mountains, an ancient line still lives, unbroken, unbent, and untouched by the rewriting of Western history. It is not just a book. It is a challenge, a quiet storm hidden in parchment and prayer. The Kebra Nagast, or the Glory of Kings, has lived in the shadows of Western history for centuries. In Ethiopia, it is sacred. In the Vatican, it is suspicious, not because it is false, but because it tells a story the Church never controlled, written in the ancient Ge'ezer's language and passed down through generations of Ethiopian priests. The Kebrast claims something the Roman Church has never dared say aloud: that Ethiopia, not Europe, holds the true royal bloodline of ancient Israel, that the Ark of the Covenant, once the holiest object on earth, was taken from Solomon's temple and brought to Axum, not by thieves, but by his own son. This claim is not new. It has chode through Ethiopian churches since the earliest centuries. But when the Vatican first received a Latin translation of the Kebrast in the early 1700s, it triggered quiet unrest behind Vatican walls. The translation had been requested by a Jesuit named Pedro Paz, who had lived for years among Ethiopian scholars. His work was met with silence when he returned. Not praise, not criticism, just silence. Because once you read the text, that silence begins to make sense. The Kebra Nagast describes Solomon's encounter with the Queen of Sheba. But it goes further. It gives her a voice full of wisdom and power. It tells of her dream where the sun left Israel and settled in her womb. It speaks of her son Menelik, born not in sin, but in prophecy. And most daring of all, it reveals that Menelik returned to Jerusalem, was welcomed by the priests, and left with the ark itself, not by force, but by divine permission. For the Vatican, this was dangerous theology. It moved the center of sacred history out of Rome, out of Europe, and into Africa. It gave Ethiopia not only a holy relic, but the spiritual authority that came with it. In a secret letter dated 196, a Vatican advisor warned the Pope that the spread of the Kebra Nagast could encourage a vision of Christian history that does not require Rome. That letter was stored in the Archivum Secretum and not seen again for 70 years. But the twist that followed came not from the text itself, but from what it inspired. When Emperor Haile Selassie ruled Ethiopia in the 20th century, he was seen not just as a monarch, but as a living link to Solomon. And for millions of people around the world, including in the Caribbean and the Americas, he became a symbol of divine kingship, a man whose authority came not from conquest but from ancient promise. The Vatican never publicly commented on the Kebra Nagast, but in the lower halls of the Apostolic Archive, one of the few copies kept there is marked with a handwritten note in the margin. It reads, "If this is true, the ark is not lost. It was never ours to guard. The Keban was never banned by the Vatican, but it was never welcomed either. It existed in a strange place, never officially condemned, yet never discussed. It was not kept in chains, only in silence, and that silence was the most telling part of all. To understand why this book was hidden for centuries, you have to understand what it did to the story the Church had spent so long building. The Kebra Nagast did not just offer a different version of Christian history. It offered a rival, a complete living tradition that had never passed through Rome, never bowed to its councils, and never asked its permission. Inside the Vatican, history was always written in layers of Latin and law, canon law, church law, sacred law. It moved through popes and councils, through cathedrals and courts. But the Kebra Nagast came from a different world, a world where sacred things were kept not behind marble, but inside caves sung in chant, guarded by monks who could not read Latin and would not kneel to the papacy. When the Jesuits first encountered the text in the 17th century, they wrote home with a mixture of wonder and concern. One described it as a mirror of the Old Testament with its own face. Another, more cautious, called it dangerously sovereign. The term meant it stood alone, outside Vatican control. That was the real threat. The book had been copied by hand for generations. It was not mass-produced, not printed in Europe, and yet it had survived. Its survival alone was a quiet challenge, a whisper in the dark saying, Rome is not the only keeper of truth. By the time the Latin translation reached the Vatican, it was treated as a curiosity, not a theological concern. Officially, the Church never responded. But unofficially, scholars were warned not to cite it. It was not to be taught in seminaries, not to be quoted in letters, and most importantly, not to be compared to the canon of the Western Bible. But silence cannot erase a story, and the more quietly it was buried, the more power it seemed to hold. In the early 1900s, a professor at the Pontifical Gregorian University began teaching from the Kebra Nagast. Within a year, his lectures were cancelled, his notes seized, and his name removed from future catalogues. No explanation was given, only a transfer to a smaller post in the countryside. Years later, he wrote in a private letter, "The book is dangerous only to those afraid of the past. That is what the Vatican feared most. Not that the Kebra Nagast was wrong, but that it was right, that it spoke of a holy line never broken, that it placed the Ark of the Covenant in the hands of another people, that it told a story without Rome. And so the book was never burned, never publicly debated, only buried in the silence between the shelves, still breathing, still waiting. The letter was never meant to be found. It had no seal, no title, and no official date. Yet it bore the unmistakable handwriting of a pope, and the faint scent of old parchment still clung to its edges. It was Discover D. In the year 1972, by a young archivist named Matteo, deep inside a drawer that had not been opened in decades. The ink had faded, but the message remained. The letter began with quiet urgency. There is a story growing in the mountains of Ethiopia. It carries with it names we have erased and a truth we chose not to inherit. If we do not act soon, we will no longer be able to ignore it. The signature at the bottom, though partially smudged, matched known handwriting samples from Pope Pius XI. He had served from 1922 until his death in 1939, a time when the Church stood between old kingdoms and rising empires, caught in the uneasy silence between wars. It was also a time when the Vatican's interest in Africa had grown rapidly and carefully. What troubled the Pope, as the letter explained, was not military or political unrest. It was the growing influence of the Kebra Nagast and its bold claim that Ethiopia carried the true bloodline of Solomon. Even worse, in the eyes of the Vatican, was the belief that Ethiopia had kept the Ark of the Covenant hidden in plain sight. The letter spoke of fear, not the fear of violence, but of a challenge to Rome's moral authority. If this belief spreads, the Pope wrote, it will fracture the foundation of our claim to universal truth. We will not be able to say we are the first nor the only. That was the conflict. The Vatican could not openly deny the Kebra Nagast without drawing attention to it, but it also could not accept it without unraveling centuries of carefully guarded history. And so the Pope gave quiet instructions to delay further publication of the text in European languages, to advise missionaries, to avoid open discussion of Solomon's line, and most importantly to monitor any attempts to bring Ethiopian theology into formal church councils. It was not a command written in anger, but in caution, as if the Pope sensed that too much light might give life to the shadows. The twist came many years later. Matteo, the archivist who found the letter, died under strange circumstances. He was young, healthy, and had no known illness. He collapsed one morning outside the Vatican library, holding a folder of handwritten notes. The folder disappeared. The letter was quietly returned to the drawer, and the drawer was sealed once again. To this day, the Church has never admitted that such a letter exists, but within the walls of the Apostolic Archive, there are whispers that even a pope once feared the story carried in the pages of a book that Rome never wrote. And that fear still lingers, quiet as candlelight. In the year 1624, a small group of Jesuit priests left Rome under the blessing of the Pope. Their mission was simple, at least on paper, to strengthen ties with the Ethiopian Church and gently guide it toward full communion with the Vatican. But beneath the surface, the purpose was far more delicate. They had been instructed to investigate the growing rumors surrounding the Kibbanagust, the Ark of the Covenant, and the supposed bloodline of Solomon, still alive in Ethiopia's royal court. They traveled in secret, dressed not in the bright red of cardinals, but in plain robes and sandals. Their leader, Father Antonio Fernandez, was known for his calm temperament and deep loyalty to the Church. He had spent years studying Eastern liturgies and was chosen for this mission because of his gift for persuasion. But as they journeyed farther into the Ethiopian highlands, something shifted. The letters stopped arriving, the reports faded, and eventually silence fell like a stone. For over a year, the Vatican heard nothing. Then, without warning, a single messenger appeared at the gates of the Apostolic Palace. He was not a Jesuit. He was a Portuguese merchant who had once traded spices along the Red Sea coast. His message was brief. "They will not return." The Vatican responded with a single note of thanks. No investigation followed. No names were added to the walls of remembrance. The entire mission was simply erased. But whispers remained. One of them came decades later from a surviving Ethiopian manuscript smuggled into Alexandria by a monk fleeing civil unrest. It described a debate held in a stone church beneath the mountains where 5 foreign priests argued against the words of the Cabrinist. The text does not name the priests, but it says one of them wept when he heard the chants of gays spoken over the ark. If the story is true, then the Jesuit mission did not vanish in violence. It was not lost to plague or war. It was broken by revelation. They had gone seeking error and found something they could not deny. One handwritten report from the year 1687, long buried in a side collection of the Vatican Library, includes a cryptic sentence. It reads, "There are truths which once seen undo the men who see them." Ethiopia has one such truth. In Rome, the story was never told, but in the hills of Libella, monks still speak of visitors who came with foreign prayers, stayed for a season, and left their Latin behind. They are remembered not as enemies, but as men who listened, and P.S. That is why the Vatican never sent another mission of that kind again. Not because the first one failed, but because it succeeded in a way no one expected. A success that frightened the Church more than any defeat. A quiet surrender written not in ink, but in silence. Deep in the highlands of northern Ethiopia, there is a place where stone does not rise toward heaven, but sinks into the earth. A place where churches were not built, but carved, cut directly into the rock by hand in silence. No scaffolding, no timber, just chisel, hammer, and prayer. The town is called Libella, and for centuries its very existence has unsettled the Vatican. There are 11 churches in Libella, each one shaped from a single block of volcanic stone hollowed from the top down. Walls, altars, columns, windows, all carved inside the earth like rooms, remembered from a dream. The work is so precise, so otherworldly, that some early European visitors refused to believe it was done by human hands. But it was. According to Ethiopian tradition, the churches were ordered by King Laela in the 12th century after he received a vision of Jerusalem during exile. Angels, the story says, guided the workers. And each night while the men rested, the angels continued the work. Within 24 years, the churches stood finished, hidden in plain sight. The Vatican first learned of libella through the reports of Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century. What they described made their superiors uneasy. It was not just the architecture, it was the rituals. Ethiopian priests chanted in gaze, lit incense in underground chapels, and performed liturgies older than anything practiced in Europe. And beneath it all there was something even more troubling, a pattern. From above, the layout of the churches formed a shape, not random, not accidental, a symbolic map, some believed, mirroring both Jerusalem and the celestial order described in the Book of Enoch, that same book the Vatican had long rejected. When one Jesuit returned to Rome with sketches of the site, he was instructed not to publish them. His notes were taken, his observations quietly dismissed, and yet they still exist, handwritten and faded, buried in the Vatican's restricted architecture collection. The real twist came years later when a Vatican archaeologist working under a different project name visited Libella in the year 1964. He was there to study the construction methods, or so the official story went, but his private notes, uncovered only after his death, tell another tale. He claimed he found markings inside the church walls, symbols that matched not Latin but ancient Hebrew and Coptic. He described a hidden chamber beneath one of the chapels sealed with a slab that had no apparent way to lift, and in his final note he wrote something that has puzzled researchers ever since. It is not that these churches were carved in stone, it is that they were carved from memory. The Vatican never commented on his findings, but no further expeditions were sent. In Libella, the silence remains. The air smells of frankincense and cold stone. Pilgrims walk barefoot through narrow trenches, whispering prayers in a language older than Rome. And the churches, carved in secret, continue to hold their mystery, not above the earth but below it, where even light must bend. There are marks in the stone, carved deep into the walls of Laib. Elas, churches, etched into pillars, painted onto manuscripts, stitched into old robes. They appear simple at first, a star, a cross, a flame. But the longer you look, the more they begin to shift, not in shape, but in meaning. Because these are not decorations, they are messages, and some of them the Vatican cannot explain. When Jesuit missionaries first walked through the churches of Ethiopia in the 16th century, they expected to find broken traces of Christian truth. What they found instead was something complete and unfamiliar. The symbols covering the walls were not like the ones in Rome. There were no halos of gold, no Latin inscriptions. Instead, there were crosses with 12 points, circles inside stars, winged figures with 6 eyes, and strange script written in flowing arcs. They asked the priests what the symbols meant. The answers were quiet. Some were too sacred to explain. Others were older than memory itself. Back in Rome, sketches of these symbols were placed into sealed envelopes and added to the private archives. Over the next 3 centuries, various scholars tried to decode them. One believed they were borrowed from ancient Jewish mysticism. Another insisted they came from the early Egyptian church, hidden during the persecutions of the Roman Empire. A third claimed they matched patterns seen in the Book of Enoch, symbols tied to the watchers. But none of these answers settled the matter, because with every attempt to explain, more questions rose. In the year 1928, a Vatican librarian named Father Gianni was granted rare access to a collection of Ethiopian manuscripts. These books had been acquired quietly, not catalogued, not displayed. One volume, in part, Icular caught his attention. It contained a list of symbols, each one followed by a line of gaze text and what appeared to be a set of instructions. One symbol, 3 interlocked circles, surrounding a single flame, was marked with a word Father Gianni had never seen. He sent a copy to the Department for the Doctrine of the Faith. Weeks later, he was reassigned. The book disappeared from the shelf. Decades later, a researcher in France studying early Christian iconography claimed he had found the same symbol carved into a wall beneath the Vatican near the ancient necropolis beneath St. Peter's Basilica. When he requested access to compare photographs, he was denied. No explanation, just a letter saying the area was undergoing restoration. But in Lalibela, the symbols remain untouched. Pilgrims still touch them with their fingers before prayer. Monks still draw them in the margins of their handwritten texts. They are not questioned, they are trusted. In the West, a symbol must be translated to have value. In Ethiopia, a symbol only needs to be remembered. And that is the mystery the Vatican cannot explain. These marks in stone do not speak to Rome. They speak to something older, something deeper, a truth passed not through councils or papal decrees, but through silence, gesture, and faith. Beneath the red earth of northern Ethiopia, there is a tunnel few speak of. It does not appear on official maps. It is not mentioned in guidebooks or church records. Yet it exists carved from stone, sealed in darkness, and said to connect two worlds that were never meant to meet. The passage was first discovered in the year 1931 by a group of local farmers near the outskirts of Lalibela. They were digging for a water channel during a long dry season when one man's shovel struck hollow. What they uncovered was not a cave, but a narrow corridor descending at a perfect angle into the ground. It was lined with smooth walls etched faintly with worn inscriptions in GZ. There were no stairs, no doors, only the echo of their footsteps as they entered. Word of the discovery reached the local priests, who immediately ordered the area sealed. But before that happened, one curious boy, the son of a merchant, crept inside with a torch in hand. He followed the passage for nearly half a mile, his flame flickering against damp stone. What he found at the end would change the way he saw his faith forever. The tunnel opened into a small hidden chamber beneath a centuries-old monastery. Inside it stood a single stone pedestal. Upon it, covered in dust, was a leather-bound book. It was not in G, it was in Latin. The twist came when the boy, now a grown man, told his story decades later to a French historian. According to him, the book contained notes from a European traveler, not a missionary, but a scholar, a man who had come to Ethiopia not to convert, but to study, and who had never left. In the margins of the pages, this man had written about ancient rituals he had witnessed. He described them as familiar, too familiar. He noted the similarities between Ethiopian and early Roman liturgies, the same symbols, the same prayers, even the same structure of the Mass. But the most shocking note was at the very end. I believe this tunnel once connected our two churches before the councils, before the split, before the silence. Back in the Vatican, the existence of the tunnel was never acknowledged. But in 1974, a request was quietly made by the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples to send a private team to Lalibela. The request was denied by the Ethiopian Church. They said the passage was sacred, not to be studied, only to be remembered. The Vatican did not press the issue. To this day, the entrance to the passage remains sealed by stone and covered by vines. But among the older priests of Lalibela there is a saying, they do not speak it aloud, only in prayer. The church was never divided by land, only by memory. And deep beneath the earth, hidden from the eyes of popes and emperors, there may still lie a doorway between faiths, carved not in conquest, but in peace. A passage that history forgot, but the stones did not. The scholar's name was Father Alio Dalba, a quiet man with sharp eyes and a voice rarely raised above a whisper. He was a Vatican-trained linguist, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. But in his final years, it was the ancient language of Ethiopia, Ge'ez, that consumed his every thought. In the year 1969, the Vatican sent him to Ethiopia under the cover of a liturgical study. His official task was to compare Ethiopian Christian chants to early Roman hymns, to trace common roots and perhaps gently encourage theological alignment. But those who knew him said his interest ran deeper. He was not there to align traditions. He was there to understand why they had separated at all. Father Alio lived for nearly 5 years in the highland monastery of Debre Damo, one of the oldest in Ethiopia. Cut off from roads reachable only by rope up a cliffside wall, the monastery was a place of silence and devotion. But beneath the prayers, the incense, and the stone cells, something else stirred. He kept a journal written in private by candlelight. He recorded sounds of unfamiliar chants, made sketches of symbols carved into the walls, and translated texts the Vatican had never seen. The monks trusted him. They believed he was not there to change them. And for the first time, Father Emilio felt like he was no longer just studying a tradition. He was entering it. Then came the final entry. It was written on a torn page, folded and hidden inside the lining of his travel bag, discovered only after his death. The handwriting was shaky, and there were dark smudges along the edges, as if written in haste. This morning I was shown the book, not a copy, not a retelling, the book itself, bound in dark red leather, too old to date, with pages that gave off the scent of frankincense. The monks called it the memory of fire. They say it is not to be read, only heard. And so they sang it to me, a liturgy not found in any Vatican archive. The words came like wind through stone. He continued, "It speaks of a time when all churches were one, before language divided us, before power sat on thrones. It tells of a covenant not broken, only moved." And in the margin, a single phrase written in both Guz and Latin, "The ark was never lost, only hidden." That was the last line he ever wrote. 3 days later he was found, alone, kneeling beside a cliff, hands folded in prayer. There were no signs of struggle, no illness, just silence. The Vatican retrieved his body, but made no mention of his work. His journal, aside from the final page, was never returned, and the monks of Debradamo offered no explanation, only a simple blessing in gaze. Some believe he found peace. Others believe he found something more, a truth too deep for Rome, too holy for paper. And perhaps that is what frightened the Vatican most. Not that he lost his faith, but that he found it. The first thing you notice is the scent, before your eyes adjust to the darkness. Before your ears catch the quiet rhythm of ancient chants, the smell reaches you, sweet, smoky, and sharp, frankincense burning slowly in a bronze censer, swinging gently from the hand of a barefoot priest. And beneath that, deeper, older still, the scent of carved stone warmed by centuries of breath and prayer. In the highland churches of Ethiopia, nothing is rushed. The walls are thick and cool, shaped from the mountain itself. Light enters not through stained glass, but through narrow cuts in the rock, soft and golden. Shadows move like water, and always the air holds that sacred blend of smoke and stone, memory and mystery. Western scholars who visit often describe a feeling of stepping out of time. But for the priests who live there, time never left. The liturgies they chant each morning have not changed since long before Rome declared its canon. The words are sung in Giz, a language the Vatican once studied but never truly embraced. The rhythm is slow, the melodies are low, they do not rise to impress. They hum like the earth beneath your feet. One visiting bishop, from Italy in the year 1961, stayed for 3 days at a monastery outside Axum. He was welcomed politely, shown the church, and invited to join in prayer. At first he was confused by the lack of pews, the unpainted walls, the worn icons darkened by centuries of candlelight. But then something happened. During a midnight vigil, a boy no older than 12 approached the altar, holding a small vessel of burning incense. As the bishop later described in a private letter, the child walked barefoot, in complete silence, except for the sound of the censer. And in that moment, I felt the smoke carry more than scent. It carried something ancient, something true. He returned to Rome and never spoke publicly of what he had seen. The twist, as with so many Vatican mysteries, lies not in the event itself, but in what followed. A short time later, his name was removed from a committee on liturgical reform. His writings were quietly shelved, and the scent of frankincense, so common in his memories, was replaced by the polished marble of St. Peter's Basilica. But in the stone churches of Ethiopia, nothing changed. The priests still wake before dawn. The incense is still lit from coals passed down each morning. The prayers rise slowly like smoke seeking the sky. No records are kept of these moments, no cameras are allowed. Yet, those who have stood in that stone silence carry it with them forever, not as a souvenir but as a secret, because in that smell, frankincense and stone, there is something more than ritual. It is the scent of a story older than Rome, burning quietly in the dark, where words fail and only memory remains. In every great cathedral, in every monastery library, in every quiet chapel, where pages turn under candle light, there is one question that echoes louder than any bell. What is canon and who decides? Canon is not just a list of books. It is the boundary between truth and heresy, between what is remembered and what is forgotten. It is the official voice of a faith carved in ink and protected by power. But behind that voice, there have always been others whispering from the shadows, asking if the canon is complete. In the West, the canon of the Bible was fixed during the Council of Trent in the 16th century. It was a time of upheaval. Protestant reformers were challenging long-held beliefs, printing Bibles in common languages, and removing books they called apocryphal. The Vatican responded with firmness. It drew a line in ink, declaring once and for all which books were sacred and which were not. But what few speak of is that this decision came late. For over 1,000 years, different Christian communities held different texts as holy. Some included the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and even Gospels that told stories of Mary and other early disciples. The Ethiopian Church, which had been practicing Christianity long before the Council of Trent, kept many of these books, and they still do. That is where the mystery begins. When Jesuit scholars first visited Ethiopia, they expected to find a simplified version of Christianity, but instead they found something older. Their hosts carried thick, leather-bound Bibles written in gaze, filled with books Rome had long dismissed. These texts were not added later. They were there from the beginning. The conflict was clear. If Ethiopia had preserved these texts from the earliest days of the Church, could it be that the Vatican had removed them? One letter written in the year 1694 by a Jesuit priest described his discomfort after reading the Book of Enoch. He wrote, "If this text is true, then the angels have fallen and man has remembered. Rome has no place for such memories. That letter was never published. It sits to this day in a sealed envelope deep inside the Vatican's archives." And yet Ethiopia continued unshaken. The twist is not just historical, it is personal. Canon is not only about what books are read, it is about who gets to tell the story. And when the Vatican set its canon, it was not just naming sacred texts, it was silencing others. In Ethiopia, the canon is not a wall but a doorway. It includes stories of fallen angels, secret wisdom, and visions that stretch beyond the stars. These are not rejected, they are embraced. And that is why the question matters so deeply. What is canon? Who decides? Because sometimes the most dangerous truths are the ones that were left out. And in those forgotten pages, a very different history waits to be remembered. The history of the Church is not only written in books, it is written in fire. For every manuscript carefully preserved in the Vatican Library, there are others that were burned, hidden, or lost. Some were erased by time, others were erased on purpose. In the early centuries after Christ, the Church had no fixed Bible. Different communities read different Gospels. Some knew the letters of Paul. Others followed texts like the Book of Enoch, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Gospel of Mary. In the deserts of Egypt and the highlands of Ethiopia, believers passed these writings by hand, trusting the Spirit to guide them. But in Rome, a new power was rising, and with power came fear. Fear that too many voices would divide the truth. Fear that mystery would become chaos. Fear that stories outside of control would spark questions no pope could answer. So, decisions were made at the Council of Laodicea in the 4th century, and again at the Council of Carthage. Church leaders began shaping the canon. Certain books were praised, others were quietly removed. By the time of the Council of Trent in the 16th century, the list was sealed and all outside texts were branded apocrypha or worse, heresy. Many of these rejected books vanished from Europe, but in Ethiopia they survived. That is what makes the Ethiopian Bible so dangerous in the eyes of the Vatican. It is not only old, it is full. It remembers what others tried to forget. A Jesuit priest stationed in the Ethiopian Highlands in the year 1673 wrote a report that never reached Rome. It was found years later in a sealed trunk. Inside he described a church ceremony where monks recited passages from the Book of Jubilees. He was stunned to see the congregation respond, with full knowledge of the text as if it had been passed down from parent to child. He wrote, "These are not rebels. They are keepers of what we lost. Their prayers carry echoes we once silenced. That silence did not always come peacefully. In France, during the Albigensian Crusade, entire libraries were burned because they held writings labeled unorthodox. In Spain, during the Inquisition, copies of Gospels deemed false were seized and destroyed. In Italy, certain texts were locked away in monasteries with instructions never to translate them. But the twist is this. Even in the Vatican's own archives, some of these so-called forbidden books still exist. Not on display, not for study, only stored. Some are marked with red wax, seals. Others bear warnings in Latin. Non videre, non legere, do not look, do not read. Still, the fire never reached Ethiopia. The books were kept, and now, centuries later, they offer a different kind of light. Not a flame that burns, but one that reveals. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing a book can do is survive. She was there at the beginning, at the cross, at the empty tomb, in the upper room where the wind moved without warning. Mary Magdalene, whose name was whispered in every corner of the early church. She was more than a witness. Some called her the apostle to the apostles. And yet in Rome's long scroll of sacred texts, her voice slowly faded, until it vanished. But not everywhere. In the highlands of Ethiopia, hidden in a monastery untouched by time, a single book remained. Its pages were hand-stitched, its ink faded with age, but its message clear. It was a gospel, not of Peter, not of John, but of Mary. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene was never included in the canon chosen by the Vatican. It was one of the books that frightened early church leaders, not for what it said, but for who said it. In this Gospel, Mary does not sit quietly in the background. She speaks, she teaches, she shares visions of the soul's journey after death, and she is challenged not by enemies but by the other disciples. Peter in one passage questions why Jesus would speak to a woman in private and not to them all. Mary replies calmly, not with power, but with peace. Her voice holds no anger, only sorrow, as if she already knows her story will be forgotten. The Vatican has never officially acknowledged this gospel. For centuries, it was thought lost, surviving only in fragments buried in desert caves. But in the early 1900s, a copy written in GZ was discovered in a remote Ethiopian monastery near Lake Tana. This version was longer, fuller, and unlike the European fragments, it had been read aloud in services for generations. A Jesuit missionary named Father Lucien was the first outsider to hear it. He wrote in his journal, "They speak of Mary as one speaks of Paul, not as a helper, but as a founder. Her words are not decoration, they are foundation." He sent a request to the Vatican to study the text further. The response was swift. His assignment ended. He was recalled to Rome and never sent on mission again. The manuscript itself was never taken. The monks refused to give it up. They called it the voice beneath the silence. To them, Mary was not forgotten. She was remembered in every song sung by candlelight, in every story passed from grandmother to child. She was part of the foundation of their faith. And perhaps that is the mystery Rome cannot solve. In its libraries, the Gospel of Mary exists only in pieces. In Ethiopia, it lives. A voice once silenced by councils now speaks from mountain walls and midnight prayers, not with the roar of power, but with the gentleness of truth. And in that soft voice, something dangerous still lingers, not rebellion, but memory. In the quiet halls of the Vatican, where marble floors echo beneath long robes and oil lamps flicker against ancient walls, there is a truth almost too fragile to say aloud. The Bible, as the world knows it today, was not only translated, it was rewritten. The word rewrite stirs discomfort, but in the early centuries of the Church, Scripture was not one book, but many scrolls. Stories of Jesus, of the apostles, of angels and visions traveled across deserts, mountains, and seas, copied by hand, passed from heart to hand, ever quite the same twice. The early Christians were not editors, they were collectors of wonder. But as the Church grew, so did its fear of confusion. Too many voices, too many versions threatened the control that Rome had begun to gather. The need for order gave rise to councils, gatherings of bishops who debated not just theology, but which words should live forever, and which should quietly vanish. By the time of the Council of Trent in the 16th century, the Bible was declared closed. No more changes, no more additions, no more wandering gospels. It was sealed with authority and defended with fire. But what came before that seal? In the 4th century, a man named Jerome was tasked by the Pope to create a single authoritative version of Scripture. Working from Hebrew, Greek, and earlier Latin texts, he shaped what would become the Vulgate, the foundation of the Roman Bible. But Jerome did not simply translate. He made decisions. He reordered books. He left some out. He added footnotes with warnings. He called the Book of Enoch dangerous. He called the Shepherd of Hermas fiction. His choices made in the silence of his study would echo across the centuries. The Vatican never hid this history. It simply never dwelled on it. In Ethiopia, things were different. Their Bible was never rewritten to match the West. It remained large, strange, and holy. It kept Enoch, kept Jubilees, kept Mary's Gospel, and others long forgotten by Rome. It was not trimmed to fit councils. It was guarded like a living memory. One Vatican scholar working in the archives in the year 1971 discovered a set of handwritten notes tucked into an old Latin Bible. They were from a bishop in the 12th century. O had once encountered an Ethiopian monk during a pilgrimage. In the margin, he wrote, "Their Bible is wild, but it burns with truth. Ours is polished, theirs is alive." That note was never published, and perhaps that is the deepest mystery of all. Not what was left in, but what was left out, not which stories survived, but who decided they should. The rewriting of the Bible was not a single act. It was a quiet war, fought with ink, sealed by power and remembered only in whispers. Yet in Ethiopia, the older story still walks barefoot and unedited through the pages of faith, and that is what Rome fears most. Not lies, but the truth it chose to forget. In the blistering heat of the Ethiopian lands, far from the stone churches of Libella and the eyes of any cardinal, there are caves. The Vatican has never entered. These caves do not echo with bells or processions. They breathe with silence. Inside them, hidden behind makeshift stone walls and tattered curtains of goat hide, lie the books the world was never meant to see. For centuries, desert monks have retreated to these caves, not to escape the world, but to guard it. They carry no weapons. They take no vows of glory. What they protect is older than gold and more dangerous than swords. They protect words. These books are not stored in libraries. They are wrapped in linen, tucked into cracks in the rock, and passed down through generations with whispered instructions. Never sell, never copy, never reveal. Each book tells a different story. One speaks of angels who taught men to write forbidden knowledge. Another describes the early days of Mary Magdalene's mission in Egypt. There are scrolls that detail visions of a sky splitting open, revealing not judgment, but memory. In the year 1932, a European explorer traveling through the Danakil Depression, was given shelter by a desert monk during a sandstorm. The monk, a man with eyes like weathered stone, offered water and a warning. "Do not ask about the books." The explorer, driven by curiosity, asked anyway. Later that night, the monk brought out a small blackened volume wrapped in palm leaves. He did not open it. He simply said, "This one was not written on earth, it was remembered." The explorer recorded this moment in his journal. He sent the notes to a university in France where they gathered dust for decades. Eventually, they reached the Vatican's attention. A quiet inquiry was launched. No official response was ever given. The twist came in the year 1977, when a Vatican archivist named Father Borger wrote a private letter to a colleague stating that a set of unclassified texts from Ethiopia had surfaced in Rome. The writing was gaze. The content, he claimed, mirrored fragments of the Book of Noah thought to be lost forever. But the twist was not in what the book said. It was in what they did not say. There was no mention of Peter, no mention of Rome, just a quiet, clear voice speaking through centuries of sand and secrecy. A voice that did not seek permission, a voice that never asked to be canonized. The Vatican did not confirm the existence of those texts, but since then, no further missions have been approved in the Danakil region. Officially, the caves are of no religious interest. Yet the monks remain, their candles still burn, and the books, hidden from popes and scholars alike, rest where they were first placed, not behind glass, but in the arms of stone, not lost, not forgotten, only waiting. In the early months of the year 1625, under the shadow of a waxing moon and the silence of drawn curtains, a sealed order was handed to a Jesuit named Father Matteo Serrano. He was not a famous scholar, not a high-ranking cardinal. He was chosen for a different reason, his obedience. The mission was clear, though never spoken aloud. Travel to the Ethiopian highlands, find the source of the theological divide, and if necessary, correct it. The letter he carried bore no crest, only a crimson wax seal stamped with a cross unlike any used in Rome. It was meant to be opened only after passing beyond the reach of familiar maps. Even among his Jesuit companions, the mission was referred to only by its nickname, Lux Caecus, the blind light. Father Matteo arrived in Massawa by sea, then made his way inland by mule. Following a path worn thin by merchants and pilgrims, he kept to himself, writing long notes in a leather journal tucked inside his robes. When asked what he was doing in Ethiopia, he replied, only studying the light. But it was not light that drew him. It was a book, one rumored to contain passages not found in any Western canon. A book said to contradict Rome's understanding of the Trinity. A book the Vatican wanted either brought back or destroyed. The locals were suspicious. They had seen men like him before. Some came with blessings, others with fire. In the village of Adwa, Father Matteo was granted shelter in a stone monastery built against the mountain. The monks there were kind but distant. They spoke in low tones and often disappeared for hours at a time, returning with faces marked by ash. It was there that Father Matteo saw the book, bound in hide, edged with iron clasps, its script written in Ge'ez, flowing like river water down the page. He did not understand the words, but he understood the silence that followed when the monks turned the pages. The twist came not in what he found, but in what he felt. In a letter never sent, discovered years later, in a forgotten Vatican drawer, Father Matteo wrote, "I was sent here to correct a false gospel. But what I have found is a gospel unbroken. They have not lost Christ. They have remembered him differently. He never returned. Some say he died of fever. Others say he chose to stay, taking a new name and vanishing into the rhythm of monastic life. The Vatican recorded the mission as incomplete. The report closed without detail. But the Ethiopian monks remember each year on the same day he arrived, they light a single candle in a room where no prayers are spoken aloud. And in the glow of that flame, the pages of the hidden book still turn, not erased, not corrected, only read. The city of Axum was quiet that morning, The market had not yet opened, and the carved stele stood like frozen giants under the pale Sunday. The streets held the scent of coffee, earth, and incense as they always had. But something was wrong. At the eastern gate, beneath a crooked fig tree, two men waited. One wore the white robes of an Ethiopian monk, the other the dark cassock of a Vatican envoy. They did not speak. Their meeting was not recorded in any official log, but what passed between them changed the future of both churches. The monk's name has been lost to time. Some say he was a guardian of the Ark, a man sworn to silence and solitude. Others say he was once a priest in Rome who vanished during a mission and reappeared years later in the Ethiopian highlands, changed and unreadable. The Vatican envoy was Father Aldo Marchesi, sent under direct orders to retrieve what he called the contested texts. His mission was to recover a small group of manuscripts believed to contain versions of Scripture long removed from the Western canon. But Father Marches had been warned. The Vatican was not only concerned with theology, they feared something deeper, an old alliance hidden in plain sight, an idea that the Church in Ethiopia was not a branch of Rome, but its equal. In his private notes, recovered after his disappearance, Father Marzi described a meeting held the night before at a small stone church on the edge of the city. The monk had shown him a book wrapped in linen and sealed with wax. Inside were pages of prayers unlike anything he had read. They spoke of a time when heaven and earth were one, when Christ walked not only in Galilee but also along the Red Sea. The names of apostles were different. The structure of the church was different. There was no mention of Peter's supremacy, only of unity broken. And then came the betrayal. The next day, the Vatican envoy returned with 2 guards and demanded the manuscript. The monk, still calm, refused. What happened next was never fully told, but by sunset, the book was gone. The church was locked, and Father March's guards were seen leaving with a sealed case under a heavy cloth. That night, the envoy vanished. Some said he fled back to Rome, shamed by what he had done. Others whispered that he never made it out of Axum, that the book he took was not what it seemed, that the silence of the monk was not submission, but warning. The Vatican never acknowledged the incident. In official records, Father Marchesi is listed as transferred without assignment. The sealed case was never found. But in Axum, he crossroads still remembers. Locals still place stones at the foot of the fig tree. Not as markers of grief, but as reminders that even where faith is strong, trust can break, and sometimes what is taken cannot be carried. In the dark corners of the Archivum Secretum, beneath layers of dust and guarded silence, lies a drawer with no name. Inside are papers folded, neatly wrapped in a faded silk ribbon. They are not marked as official correspondence, no seal, no reply. They are the letters never sent. The author was Father Domenico Fina, a Jesuit scholar once stationed in Gondar during the late 1700s. His mission, according to Vatican orders, was simple: observe Ethiopian rites and report back on errors of doctrine. But what began as an academic task soon turned into something else. The more time he spent among the priests and monks of the Ethiopian Church, the more uncertain he became of his own purpose. He began writing a series of private letters addressed to the Superior General of the Jesuit Order, known within church circles as the Black Pope. These were not dry field reports. They were confessions. His words were careful, but there was a quiet desperation beneath the surface. He described liturgies that seemed older than any Roman text. He wrote of children reciting psalms from books that had never been translated into Latin. He spoke of icons that portrayed Christ, with unfamiliar symbols, stars, wings, circles within circles. In one letter, dated the March 5th, 1778, he wrote, "I no longer believe we were sent to correct them. I believe we were sent to keep them from correcting us." But here is the twist. None of these letters were mailed. They were found unopened, in a satchel discovered behind a false panel in the Vatican storage vaults during renovations in the year 1954. The satchel had been hidden so deliberately that archivists initially believed it was part of a forgotten wall. When they opened it, they expected old translations or travel logs. Instead, they found the quiet voice of a man losing his certainty. One letter stood out. It was sealed in wax, though not with any official stamp. Instead, it bore a symbol, 3 interwoven crosses. Inside, Father Domenico detailed a meeting with a high-ranking Ethiopian priest who had shown him a page from a codex believed to be lost in the West, the Book of the Mysteries of the Heavens and the Earth. The priest claimed it had been kept in secret since the 4th century. He told Father Domenico that Rome had removed certain truths and that Ethiopia had hidden them not in fear but in faith. The letter ends with a single line. If this truth is ever known, it will not be through argument but through remembering. Why were the letters never sent? Was Father Domenico silenced, or did he choose silence himself, knowing that some truths cannot be explained, only preserved? The Vatican never commented on the discovery. The satchel was quietly placed into storage again, catalogued without title, but the letters remain, and in their silence a message continues to echo, not of rebellion, not of defiance, but of something far older. A voice once raised in loyalty, now whispering from the shadows of history. The air at Debre Libonos was still on that morning in May, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Nestled in the cliffs north of Addis Ababa, the monastery had stood for centuries as a sacred site of peace, prayer, and memory. But in the year 1937, that silence was broken, not by bells or hymns, but by gunfire. The Italian occupation of Ethiopia had already brought cruelty to the land. But what happened at Debre Libanos left a wound so deep even the pages of history hesitate to turn back to it. Over 2,000 monks, deacons, and pilgrims were gathered there for the annual commemoration of the monastery's founding. Most had come on foot, carrying only faith and bread. But they were not the only ones watching. Italian soldiers under orders from General Pietro Maletti surrounded the site under the claim that a plot had been uncovered, a supposed connection between the clergy and an assassination attempt on the Italian viceroy. The Vatican at the time said nothing publicly. The church in Rome remained silent even as the massacre began. By dusk, the green grass around Debre Libanos was stained dark. The clergy, including elderly monks and teenage novices, were lined up and executed beside the river that ran below the cliff. Their bodies were thrown into the gorge, their names never fully recorded. But here is where the mystery deepens. Among the monks killed that day were 3 scribes who had been working on a special codex, a hand-illuminated manuscript that included rare passages from the Book of Baruch, the Book of Tobit, and the Book of Enoch. The codex was rumored to contain a commentary written by an unknown Ethiopian theologian describing the arrival of European missionaries and a warning about Rome's manipulation of Scripture. The codex was never recovered. The Vatican made no official effort to locate it. However, a letter surfaced decades later, T10 by a Red Cross worker who had visited the region after the massacre. She wrote of seeing a soldier walking away from the site, carrying a wrapped bundle bound in leather and covered in ash. When asked what it was, the soldier said only a book, one they died to protect. The Vatican's archives contain no formal record of the massacre. Even in modern Vatican statements on the events of Ethiopia during the war, Debre Libanos is rarely named. A few lines appear in internal reports, marked with words like sensitive and unconfirmed, but the Ethiopian Church remembers. Every year the monks return to the same ground, lighting candles not only for the dead, but for the missing. They believe the codex still exists, hidden by one of the surviving novices, passed down in secret, not as revenge, not as protest, but as preservation. Some secrets are buried in silence, others in blood. The train pulled into Rome just before sunrise. A thick mist clung to the tracks, wrapping the station in a dull hush, as if the city itself was still deciding whether to wake. Among the few passengers who stepped onto the platform, one man stood apart. His coat was torn, his satchel was worn thin. His collar, once stiff with pride, now drooped with the weight of miles and silence. His name was Father Luca Benedetti. He had been gone for nearly 5 years, sent to Ethiopia by the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. Father Luca's task was described in vague but urgent terms. His mission to establish new alignment with the Ethiopian Church, to bring clarity to doctrine, and above all to recover certain texts rumored to be in the hands of desert clergy. The Vatican had grown uneasy with whispers of alternate gospels, prophecies, and scrolls still in use beyond the grasp of Rome. He was chosen because he was obedient, not curious, not bold, just faithful. But something changed in the highlands. When Father Luca returned, no crowd greeted him. No bells rang from St. Peter's, no carriage waited, only a single assistant from the Vatican archives holding a letter with one line, "Report to the congregation." No delay. He never did. Instead, he went directly to his quarters near the Lateran Palace, where he closed the curtains and lit a single candle. He unpacked his satchel slowly. Inside were no books, no scrolls, no reports, only a small folded cloth. When he opened it, a single page of vellum fell out. The writing was in Gua, and at the bottom a symbol, 3 crosses, enclosed in a circle. He placed it on the table and stared at it for hours. That night he wrote a letter not to the Vatican, but to a friend he had studied with decades before. In the letter he confessed something extraordinary. "I went to convert them," he wrote, "but I was the one who changed. I found a faith, not lost in ritual but alive in memory. They carry truths we have buried beneath stone and protocol, and I know that if Rome saw what I saw, the walls would crack." The letter was never sent. It was discovered in his drawer. Years later, after his death, the Vatican never questioned him. No meeting was ever recorded, no public statement made. He simply faded from view, tucked away, in a quiet clerical post in the outskirts of the city, a man who had returned from the edge of history with no glory, no triumph, and one unspeakable secret, the twist. When his quarters were cleared, that single pag of vellum was gone. And no one, not the archivists, not the priests, not even the Swiss guard on duty, could explain how the sealed room had been opened. Sometimes the greatest threat to power is not a weapon. It is a witness. High in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, where the air is thin and the trees grow twisted by wind, stands a monastery older than memory. It is called Abba Gara, named after the saint who founded it over 1,000 years ago. Some say he arrived from the east on foot. Others say he fell from the sky during a storm, holding a book that glowed in the rain. The Vatican has long known of Abaima. It appears in old mission records as a site of interest, marked with red ink and never followed up. What makes the place more than legend is a single manuscript, a codex, so old scholars believe it may be the earliest Christian text still bound in its original cover. Its pages shimmer faintly in the light, written in gears, untouched by decay. But what truly unsettled the Vatican was not its age. It was a prophecy written in its final lines in faded ink, attributed to Abarima himself. The prophecy speaks of a time when the truth would no longer be carried by kings or guarded by walls, a time when the scrolls of the righteous would outlive the cathedrals of the powerful. It warns of a distant church, one wrapped in golden shadow, that would forget the face of Christ. When the Vatican first learned of the manuscript, in the year 1958, they sent a team quietly, not an official delegation, but a trio of researchers under the cover of a pilgrimage. They were told to assess the codex, verify its authenticity, and if possible, arrange for its transfer to Rome for preservation. The monks refused. One of the researchers, a young Italian scholar named Lorenzo Bellini, kept a journal. In it he described the moment he saw the final page. The monks allowed him one look. He wrote, "There were no gold leaves, no embellishments, no signature, only a line that read, 'The one who rewrites the word shall forget the word.'" That night, the Vatican team left without the manuscript, but Bellini never returned to Italy. 2 weeks later, he sent a letter to his family. saying he had chosen to remain in Ethiopia. He wanted to learn the old tongue, walk the paths of the desert, fathers, and study what he called a truer memory. He was never heard from again. The Vatican has never acknowledged the prophecy. It remains unlisted in official documents. The name of Abagarima is rarely spoken in church texts except in passing. Yet deep in the mountains, the codex still rests in a small stone room wrapped in cloth, watched over by a single monk who never sleeps indoors. They believe the prophecy is not a warning. They believe it is a reminder. That truth once spoken does not belong to those who fear it, but to those who carry it quietly across time. In the year 1931, under the pale flicker of an oil lamp, a British scholar named Edward Mallory opened a wooden chest in a hilltop monastery near Lake Tana. He had come looking for history, not miracles. But what he found that night would never leave him. Inside the chest were 3 scrolls wrapped in layers of old linen, their edges curled and worn from centuries of quiet handling. The monks called them Eyes of the Night. At first, Mallory thought it was a poetic name, but when the lamp sputtered and the room died into near darkness, something strange happened. The letters on the scrolls began to glow. It was not a bright light, not a firefly's pulse, or the shimmer of gold leaf. It was softer, like moonlight reflecting on water. Each line of G's script appeared as if lit from within, the ink releasing a faint blue hue that danced across the parchment. Mallory, shaken but curious, asked the monk beside him how it was possible. The old man smiled gently and said, "Some words were not written with ink. They were remembered with light." Mallory would later record this event in his private journal. The entry was never meant for publication. He feared ridicule or, worse, seizure of the scrolls. But years later, that journal was donated to a small library in Cambridge. There, in faded ink, his notes told of 3 manuscripts unlike anything he had seen across the Middle East, North Africa, or Europe. He wrote, "These are not stories. They are instructions, and yet no explanation of their content matches the feeling of standing near them in the dark. The words seem to breathe. News of the glowing scrolls quietly reached the Vatican by way of a Jesuit linguist stationed in Cairo. A request was made to transfer the scrolls to Rome for study and preservation. The monks of Lake Tana refused, but weeks later, during the rainy season, the monastery was struck by lightning. Part of its archive room was destroyed. 2 monks perished. The chest was never found in the rubble. That might have been the end of the story. But here is the twist. In the year 1972, a visiting cardinal touring the Vatican Library reported something unusual. He claimed to have seen a locked glass case in a private corridor containing a scroll that glimmered when the lights were turned off. When he asked about it, the archivist changed the subject. There is no official listing of such a scroll in the Vatican catalogue, but in a restricted storage area known only to a handful of clerics, there are cases without names, without labels, just darkness and silence. To this day, some believe the manuscripts were never lost, that the Vatican did retrieve at least one, not to display but to hide, because if words can glow in the dark, perhaps they carry something more than ink and memory. Perhaps they carry the one thing power fears most, truth that cannot be put out. In the spring of 1924, a rolled parchment arrived at the Vatican Library, wrapped in goatskin and tied with a cord of braided reed. It had no return address, only a note tucked inside the wrapping, recovered near the source of the Blue Nile. "Do not translate in haste." The scroll was passed from desk to desk, from one scholar to the next. At first glance, it looked like any other Ethiopian manuscript written in Ge'ez or perhaps Sabbaic, but when they unrolled the parchment and studied the symbols, unease settled over the room. It was not Ge'ez, it was not Hebrew, it was not Arabic, Aramaic, Latin, or Coptic. The script curved like vine branches but did not match any known alphabet. Some letters floated above the lines like breath, others twisted inward as if meant to be read not with the eyes but the soul. For weeks the Vatican's best linguists worked in silence. They consulted ancient glossaries and forgotten scrolls, even comparing it to angelic alphabets rumored to be used by early mystics. Nothing made sense. The spacing of the line-ness suggested rhythm like prayer or chant, yet there was no known tongue it matched. Cardinal Severino, head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the time, visited the study room personally. After observing the scroll, he ordered it locked away, but not before whispering something to his aide. If it cannot be read, it was not meant for us. But here is where the mystery deepens. In 1926, a Jesuit missionary named Father Agugust Lamitra, stationed in Eratra, claimed to have seen a monk reading aloud from a scroll with that very same script. He described the sound as haunting, melodic, and echoing, though the reader spoke in barely a whisper. When asked what language it was, the monk answered, calmly, "It is the tongue of those who walked before Babel." Father Lamitra recorded the moment in a private letter sent to Rome, which was later sealed and never made public. But decades later, a researcher working in the Vatican's restricted archives found a fragment of that letter. The final sentence read, "I understood nothing, and yet I wept." The twist came not in translation but in dreams. Several scholars who worked closely with the manuscript began experiencing vivid dreams, visions of cities made of crystal, stairways reaching into clouds, and voices that sang without words. One professor left Rome altogether, retreating to a monastery in silence. Another vanished during a trip to Jerusalem. To this day, the Vatican denies possessing any such scroll. No record of the script exists in its public catalogue, but whispered among certain archivists is the belief that the manuscript was not meant to be translated because it does not speak to the mind, it speaks to memory. Not the memory of one person or even one culture, but something older, a language, spoken before time kept records, before stories were written down, when truth passed from soul to soul, not page to page. In the winter of 1963, during an unusually cold December, a crate arrived at the Vatican from Addis Ababa. It bore no diplomatic seal, no official markings, just a handwritten label for the Archivum Secretum handle. With reverence, the crate was small, no bigger than a suitcase, but its contents would become the subject of whispered conversations for decades. Inside lay a single book, heavy, bound in something that was not quite leather. The texture was strange, soft, but not animal hide. The archivist who first unwrapped it later described the feeling as skin that remembered being alive. No title marked the cover, no symbol, no stamp, only a faint discoloration, a shadow of a handprint pressed into the binding as if someone long ago had touched it for the last time. The Vatican initially listed it as Seeks Obscura, Item 4, a placeholder name, but the scholars who examined it privately began calling it something else, the Flesh Gospel. Some claimed the pages were made from traditional parchment, but the cover was another story. A biologist from the University of Milan was quietly invited to examine the material. She reported that the DNA structure matched human tissue, possibly from multiple individuals. That report was never made public. Her laboratory was later destroyed in a fire. No one was harmed, but the original samples were lost. And yet, the mystery did not end with the skin. Inside the codex were texts that had no known origin. They reference stories from the Book of Enoch, fragments of apocalyptic visions and prayers written in gaze that were not found in any other manuscript. One passage described a gate hidden in the desert, beyond which angels no longer serve but wait. Another recounted the descent of beings from the high places, not fallen but sent to teach, to warn, to watch. One particular section troubled the scholars most. It detailed a ritual in which knowledge is not read but absorbed through touch. The reader must place their hand upon the cover and listen, not with ears, but with what the text called the bone behind the breath. No one would admit to trying it. But one priest, a man named Father Roberto Scella, was found in his chamber days later, surrounded by candles and scribbled pages. He had written the same sentence over and over: "It is not dead. It is only waiting." The Vatican removed the codex from circulation. It now rests in a temperature-controlled vault beneath the Apostolic Palace. Officially, it does not exist. The crate it came in was destroyed. The archivist who received it was reassigned to a remote post in South America. But the legend remains. Some say the book was wrapped in human skin, not to honor the dead, but to trap what was inside. That it is not merely a text but a vessel, and that if it is ever opened fully, not with hands, but with belief, it may speak again. The question is, to whom? In the year 1939, while the world outside fell into war, a quiet discovery took place beneath the marble floors of the Vatican Library. A monk named Brother Anelmo, charged with restoring fragile manuscripts, was given a bundle of old parchment pulled from an unmarked crate. The pages were brittle with age, and yet strangely untouched by time. What caught his eye first was not the language, though it was Giz, an ancient script few could still read, but the ink. It shimmered faintly, like wet paint on stone, though the pages were said to be over 1,000 years old. No matter how many times the parchment was handled, no matter how much light or air touched it, the letters remained vivid. Not one line had faded. Brother Anselmo, a man trained in the slow art of preservation, had never seen anything like it. He called it the ink that breathes. The Vatican's conservators examined the manuscript under magnification, searching for clues. The ink contained no trace of iron, gall, or soot. When tested, it reacted strangely, glowing under candlelight, yet dull under sunlight. And at night, if left alone in the dark, the pages gave off a faint blue hue, as if they remembered being read. One passage in particular drew immediate attention, a short phrase written in larger script than the rest. 5 words centered on the page. Translated roughly, it read, "The truth preserves itself in fire." The moment this line was recorded, the manuscript was removed from circulation, but not before a young Ethiopian scholar named Tezgen Yohannes took a sketch of the page. He had been brought in by a sympathetic Jesuit to assist with translation, but after copying the phrase, he was dismissed from the project without warning. Days later, his small guest room near the Tiber was found abandoned. No signs of struggle, only a torn page from his notebook left under his pillow. The twist came 2 years later, during an unrelated examination of medieval texts from the hills of northern Ethiopia. A Vatican researcher discovered an almost identical phrase written in the margin of a completely different codex. Same style, same ink, same glow. But this codex had never left Ethiopia. The 2 books were separated by oceans, by centuries, yet bore the same hand, or so it seemed. The ink, it appeared, was not simply material. It was memory. To this day, the Vatican will not comment on the manuscript. It is said to be sealed in the Arch of the Secretum, placed inside a lead-lined container, kept far from light, not because of its fragility, but because of what it resists: silence, obscurity, erasure. Brother Anelmo died in 1952. His last words whispered to the librarian who cared for him were simple: "It is not that the ink cannot fade. It is that the true. They say the Ark of the Covenant was lost time, swallowed by war, fire, or theft. But in the hills of northern Ethiopia, beneath the shade of whispering fig trees, there is a small chapel guarded by one man. He never leaves the grounds. He does not speak to visitors. He does not eat with others. His life is devoted to a single purpose: to guard what his people believe is the holiest object on earth. The Ark. Not a replica, not a symbol. The Ark. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Ark was brought to Axum nearly 3,000 years ago by Menelik, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. It was not stolen. They say it was taken from Jerusalem with the blessing of heaven itself, carried across deserts and mountains, hidden in the highlands. Ever since, it has been protected by generations of monks, watched over by a single guardian chosen for life. The Vatican has never officially recognized the clay. But that has not stopped its curiosity. In the early 1900s, a series of Vatican envoys were quietly sent to Ethiopia. Their missions were not public, nor were their reports. One of them, Father Bartolo Gusti, wrote a letter now sealed deep in the Archivum Secretum. In it, he describes the outer structure of the chapel in Axum and the rituals surrounding it. He never saw the ark, but he described feeling something old and pressing, as if the ground itself remembered what was inside. What the Vatican feared was not only the possibility that the ark was real, but that it had never belonged to them. Rome had spent centuries shaping the symbols of power. Relics were more than sacred. They were instruments of control. Bones of saints, slivers of the true cross, thorns from the crown, all carefully guarded in golden reliquaries. But the ark, that was different. The ark was the voice of God himself. It had parted waters. It had crushed walls. It had judged kings. If such an object rested, not in Rome but in Africa, the entire narrative of church authority would crack. The twist came during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War in the year 1937. Italian soldiers under orders from Mussolini's regime approached the chapel in Axum. They never entered. According to an account written years later by an Ethiopian priest, the soldiers stopped at the chapel's gate, looked up at the sky, and fled. One of them swore he heard a sound like thunder, though the day was clear. What happened that day remains a mystery. But after that, the Vatican's inquiries into the ark stopped. No more letters, no more missions. Today the chapel still stands. The guardian still watches. No photographs exist of the interior. No scholar has verified what lies within. But the silence speaks volumes. For in the deepest halls of the Vatican, where the oldest secrets are kept behind locked drawers, there is a folder without a label. And inside it, they say, is only one thing. A map of Axum, folded 12 times and a single word written across the top. Returned. In the heart of Axum, behind a high stone wall and iron gate, stands a cathedral most will never see inside. It is not large, not golden, not filled with tourists or music. It is simple, even plain from the outside, yet it holds a silence that feels heavy. This is the chapel of the tablet, and it is the most forbidden place in all of Ethiopia. No one enters, not priests, not kings, not scholars or presidents. Only one man, the guardian of the ark, is allowed to cross its threshold. He does not leave the grounds. He does not speak to the press. He sleeps in a small stone house beside the chapel and spends his life in service to what he protects. The building itself is not ancient. It was rebuilt in the 20th century beside the older St. Mary of Zion Cathedral, but the contents within are believed to be thousands of years old. It is said that the Ark of the Covenant lies inside, brought to Ethiopia by Menelik, son of King Solomon, and hidden ever since. The Vatican has never denied the story outright, but it has never confirmed it either. In the year 1978, a Vatican representative named Paolo Mancini, was sent to Axum under the pretense of interfaith dialogue. What he truly wanted was a glimpse of the sacred object. He met with elders, visited churches, and offered gifts. But when he asked to see inside the chapel, the reply was Fin, Al. No. He left Axum 2 days later and never spoke publicly about the trip again. But 5 years later, his personal journal was found after his death. One page written in careful Latin stood out. It read, "What is hidden here is not myth, it is legacy, and we were too late." Back in Rome, rumors began to spread among archivists and scholars not only about the Ark itself, but about why no one could go inside the chapel. Some believed that stepping over the threshold without divine purpose would bring death. Others claimed the Ark radiated a type of light that could not be seen by human eyes, but could be felt in the bones. One story passed quietly among Ethiopian priests tells of a young novice who once attempted to peek through a crack in the chapel door. He did not speak again for the rest of his life. The twist came in the year 2005 when a new guardian was chosen. As is tradition, the previous one passed away shortly after the appointment, as if the burden of keeping the Ark drained a man's very soul. The Vatican sent a letter of condolence, but included a request for dialogue. That letter was never answered. What lies inside the cathedral remains unconfirmed by any modern authority, but perhaps that is the point. Not all truths are meant for study. Some must remain behind closed doors, not because they are false, but because they are too powerful to be touched. Beneath the golden glow of St. Peter's Basilica, far below the polished marble floors and echoing choir stalls, rests a network of rooms few have ever entered. These chambers are not filled with books nor scrolls, but with objects, hundreds of them, bones, shrouds, thorns, pieces of wood, cloth, glass, and stone. Each one is sealed in a box, locked behind brass doors, labeled in Latin and guarded in silence. These are the Vatican's relics, and they are not simply for remembrance, they are for power. Since the earliest centuries of Christianity, Rome has collected the sacred remnants of saints and martyrs, a finger bone from Thomas, a lock of Mary's hair, a fragment of the manger where Christ was said to have lain. These relics are believed to hold divine presence, holy energy that continues to work miracles. Pilgrims journey thousands of miles just to glimpse them. But what most never realize is how fiercely they are protected, not just for faith, but for control. A relic is not just a piece of the past, it is a claim. It says, "This is ours," and in the eyes of the Church, owning a sacred object means owning part of the story itself. This obsession grew fiercest during the Crusades. As knights swept through the Holy Land, they returned with fragments of crosses, cloth stained with old blood, and stones from the hills of Golgotha. Many were real, many were not, but the truth mattered less than the symbol. Rome became the center, not just of faith, but of possession. But then came a quiet challenge from the east. In the highlands of Ethiopia, there were relics no pope had ever touched, manuscripts older than Rome, icons never seen by Western eyes, and perhaps most troubling of all, the Ark of the Covenant itself. If that Ark was real, and if it truly rested in Axum, then Rome's entire collection would be second. No relic in the Vatican could compare to the object that once held the voice of God. That fear was not spoken aloud, but behind closed doors. Meetings were held, letters were sent, envoys were dispatched. In one private record from the year 1954, a cardinal wrote of his concern that Ethiopia's relics held a story older than ours. The phrase was underlined twice. The twist came when a secret delegation was sent to Ethiopia during the reign of Haile Selassie. Their official purpose was diplomatic. Their true mission was cataloging relics. They returned with nothing in their hands, but their eyes told another story. One of the men resigned from the clergy soon after. Today, Rome's vaults remain full, but something has changed. It is said that among the oldest boxes, tucked into the lowest shelf of the most secure chamber, there is an empty reliquary. No label, no name, only a note carved in Latin, so old the letters are beginning to fade. Taken before us, never returned. It was the spring of 1947 when a little-known Vatican figure boarded a ship from Naples under a false name. He wore no papal ring. No Swiss guard followed him. No reporters tracked his movement. The man was Albino Lucani, a future pope, though no one would have guessed it then. His mission was quiet, unannounced, and undocumented, an unofficial visit to Africa that would vanish from church records for more than 30 years. The journey took him through Eritrea, then into the highlands of Ethiopia. He traveled by train, then by foot, speaking little, always writing in a leather-bound journal he kept close to his chest. When he reached Axum, he paused, not as a leader of faith, but as a pilgrim in awe. The stories had reached Rome long before him. Tales of the Ark, hidden monasteries, sacred books untouched by Latin hands, but nothing had prepared him for what he found. Inside an old church near the old palace ruins, he was shown a series of illuminated manuscripts. The priest who guided him spoke perfect Italian, but offered no explanations, just page after page of ancient J's script, filled with images of angels, suns, and black-robed figures kneeling in fire. Luciani wrote in his journal, "The faith here is older than memory and twice as silent." One evening he was invited to sit with an elder monk who had served the church for over 70 years. They spoke by firelight, and though Luciani could not understand the monk's words, he felt something pass between them, an understanding not of language, but of reverence. He returned to Rome 2 weeks later quietly, with no public report. But his private writings tell a different story. Hidden in the back of his journal is a single line written in Latin and circled 3 times. "They never needed us." And that is the true danger. When Luciani became Pope John Paul I in 1978, he served only 33 days. Before his sudden death, no autopsy was performed. The official cause was a heart attack. Yet whispers have followed ever since. Some say he had intended to release certain documents tied to the Ethiopian Church. Others believe he had begun drafting a new approach to interfaith dialogue, one that acknowledged Ethiopia not as a younger branch of Rome, but as its twin. The twist lies in the redacted archive labeled East Missions 47. The file contains torn pages, missing letters, and one photograph with the edges burned. In it, a young Luciani stands outside the chapel of the tablet, looking not at the building, but at the sky. What he saw there, no one can say. But deep in the Vatican archives, an older clerk once claimed he heard Luciani's voice in a recording. The tape was almost silent, except for 6 soft words. Some relics are not meant to return. In the late 1930s, under the shadow of war and empire, the Vatican made a quiet request. It was not written in any official letter. It did not pass through diplomatic hands. Instead, it traveled through whispers from Rome to Addis Ababa, carried by men who did not wear cassacks but uniforms. Their mission was simple in words, impossible in spirit: bring the Ark to Rome. The plan had formed years earlier during Mussolini's campaign in Ethiopia. As Italian forces swept through the country, seizing towns and treasures, certain figures within the Vatican saw an opportunity. If the Ark of the Covenant truly existed, if it was not just legend but artifact, it must be brought to the heart of Christendom. Not for study, they said, but for protection. In private, others used a different word: possession. The idea was not to steal in darkness, but to relocate under the veil of salvation. One document now hidden in the Vatican archives was titled Operation Exodus. It outlined a plan to remove the Ark under cover of religious ceremony, claiming it had been offered willingly. The Ethiopian Church would be told it was temporary, a gesture of unity, a sacred exchange between brothers in faith. But the monks in Axum did not believe in exchange, and they did not forget the last time Rome had taken something in the name of unity. When Italian soldiers approached the chapel of the tablet in 1937, the guardian stood alone at the gate, holding nothing but a wooden cross. He said no words. He did not move. The soldiers, confused, radioed back for our dears. They were told to wait, but by nightfall something changed. One of the soldiers, years later, confessed in a letter never sent. He wrote that as dusk fell, the chapel began to glow, not with fire, but with a pale light that seemed to move like breath. Birds stopped singing. The air thickened, and from within the chapel walls came what he described as a sound. Without sound, a silence so deep it hurt. They left the gate untouched. Rome never acknowledged the mission. The name Operation Exodus was erased from all official records, and yet in 1962, during the Second Vatican Council, an Ethiopian bishop was given an unusually long private audience with the Pope. No transcript was made, no summary recorded. But afterward, the Pope was said to have cancelled a planned pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Instead, he asked to walk the halls of the archives alone. The Ark never came to Rome. It remains in Axum, untouched, unseen, unclaimed. But the attempt left a mark, a memory buried in the silence between two churches. Some say that failure changed the Vatican, that it reminded the highest powers in Rome that not everything holy belongs to them. Some mysteries are not meant to be held, and the greatest treasures are the ones that refuse to be taken. There is a room beneath the Vatican library where time feels like it has stopped. The light is dim, filtered through thick glass blocks set into the ceiling. The walls are lined with shelves, some empty, some filled with aging boxes tied shut with string, and in one corner, behind a steel gate with no official key, rests a book that no one is supposed to know exists. It is not listed in any catalogue, not even the secret ones. Archivists call I.T. the Red Book, though it is bound not in bright crimson, but in a deep, almost black shade of leather. The spine is worn, the pages are thick, the lettering is handwritten in gears, a script the average Vatican scholar cannot read. There is no title, no author, only a single symbol burned into the front. Cover, a winged creature with 3 faces staring in different directions. The first time this book arrived in Rome, it caused confusion. The year was 1929. It was part of a shipment of texts rescued from a monastery during regional conflict in Ethiopia. Most were sent to translation rooms, but this one was set aside almost immediately. A young Jesuit scholar opened it and fainted before he could finish the second page. He never explained why. The book was moved to a private vault marked as pending translation. It was never touched again, at least not officially, yet over the years whispers began to circulate among the Vatican's most trusted scribes. They spoke of the book that did not age. One archivist claimed he saw a page turn by itself. Another, after being alone in the room too long, quit the church without explanation and returned to his village in the Alps. He never stepped into a library again. In the 1950s, a researcher attempted to catalog the book. He gave it a placeholder number and began filling out the registry form, but every time he wrote its name, the ink disappeared. He tried again with a different pen, then a pencil, then chalk. The page stayed blank. The form was filed anyway, empty but sealed, stored in the back of the archive. That seal was later found cracked, though the registry room was always locked. No one ever admitted to opening it. In recent years, a rumor spread that the book contains an alternate version of the Book of Enoch, one that blends the story of the Watchers with prophecies not found in any known canon. Some believe it speaks of 3 hidden arks placed in different lands, each holding a piece of divine fire. Others say it names names, popes, kings, and saints with dates of birth, death, and something stranger, return. Today, if you ask any Vatican official about the book, they will tell you it does not exist. But sometimes, in the still hours of the night, the guard on duty swears he hears pages turning in the dark, even when no one is there. It was found inside a velvet pouch hidden behind the drawer of a Vatican archivist's desk, one that had not been opened since his death in the year 1968. The man, Brother Matteo Ferrani, was quiet, meticulous, and known for organizing the most fragile manuscripts with care. He rarely spoke during meals. He spent long hours in the lowest level of the archivum secret, and then one morning he did not come to work. His heart had stopped in his sleep, or so they said. The key was discovered by the man who took his place. It was small, cold to the touch, made of a dark metal that did not match anything else in the archive. The teeth were strange, too fine, too many. Not one archivist could name the lock it belonged to. It had no tag, no number. It fit no known door. Still, the Vatican kept it. A file was started, as all strange finds are, but it grew thin very quickly. No architect recognized the key's style. No locksmith could replicate it. It was placed in a sealed envelope and moved to a drawer marked unassigned. Over time it became something of a quiet joke between scribes. The key to nowhere, the key to the kingdom. the key to a door the church forgot. But then, in the spring of 1983, something odd happened. A visiting Ethiopian scholar brought in to study the gaze scrolls was shown the key during a tour. He did not laugh. Instead, he turned pale. He asked to sit down, and after a long silence, he told them something that turned the entire room quiet. He had seen a door like it before, not in Rome but in a monastery, hidden near the Eritrean border. He said the key was shaped like the ancient sun cross used in pre-Christian temples, and in the monastery he visited as a child, there was a stone gate sealed for centuries with no handle, only a narrow slot in the shape of that same symbol. When he tried to explain further, the tour was ended. That night, his hotel room was found empty. He left behind his luggage and passport. No report was filed, no trace ever found. In the years since, the key has been moved twice, once to a private cabinet in the papal apartments, once again to a wall safe inside the archives behind a portrait of a long-dead pope whose name is no longer spoken. Some believe it is just a curiosity. Others believe it opens something not made by human hands. A few whispers suggest that somewhere beneath the Vatican, lower than the catacombs, deeper than the tombs, there is a sealed chamber with no record, no light, and no air, a door with no name waiting for one key and a secret the church was never meant to unlock. In the winter of 1937, Pope Pius X sat alone in his study, surrounded by unopened letters and maps of Africa. Outside, Rome was restless. Italy's armies had marched deep into Ethiopia, and the Holy See had received reports not just of war, but of relics, books, and churches no Western eye had seen. Among the documents placed on the Pope's desk that night was one file bound in twine marked urgent eyes only. It came from a Jesuit contact stationed near Lake Tana. Inside were sketches, journal entries, and a translated passage from a scroll found deep in the hills of the Ethiopian highlands. The words written in gaze told of a prophecy involving a lost gospel, a black lion, and a city of stone hidden beneath the earth. One line was underlined in red ink: "When Rome touches what it does not understand, the fire will rise." Pope Pius X read the sentence 3 times. Then he asked for the door to be locked. He was a man of firm order, a scholar by heart, and, though he believed in knowledge, he also feared what it could undo. The Vatican had collected secrets for centuries, some too dangerous to speak aloud. But this was different. This was not legend. This was not rumor. This was something that could shift the very spine of Christian history. What disturbed him most was not the story itself, but the source. The scroll had been authenticated. The ink matched pre-Christian methods. The parchment had aged in a way consistent with texts over 2,000 years old. And the translation, cross-cheed with 3 separate scholars, was clear. It spoke not of a Messiah coming from the line of David, but from a union between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. It placed the ark not in Jerusalem but in Axum. It told of a church not built on Peter's bones, but on a covenant made in the African highlands. That same night, the Pope gave a verbal order to his secretary: close the Ethiopian file. Move the scroll to the vault. Restrict all research related to Ethiopian texts, prophecies, and relics unless personally approved by the Holy Office. The next morning, a notice was issued within the Vatican archives. A new classification system was created. The Ethiopian collection was placed under a special lock, given a new name: Index Sanctus Obscura, the index of hidden holy things. Years later, after Pope Pius XI died under quiet circumstances in 1939, his personal files were examined, but the file on Ethiopia was missing. Only his handwritten note remained, tucked between the pages of his Bible. "What we silence today may return in fire tomorrow, but let the Church be spared that reckoning. No pope has ever reversed his order, and the records remain sealed." She was known only as a Baba, a name meaning flower in the old Ethiopian tongue, a healer, a mystic, and a woman said to speak with angels. Her life unfolded in the green hills near Lake Tana during the late 1700s. Local priests called her blessed. Villagers claimed she raised the dead, and for a time even the Vatican considered her for sainthood. Her story first reached Rome through a Jesuit letter dated 1821, carried by hand across deserts and sea. The letter described Abab's visions, her cures, and her ability to recite entire passages of Scripture, including verses not found in any Bible approved by Rome. She spoke in Ge'ez, yet when transcribed, her words mirrored fragments from early Christian texts lost since the 2nd century. That alone drew the Church's attention. A Vatican envoy, Father Lorenzo Dionte, was dispatched to investigate. He arrived in Ethiopia under the cover of pilgrimage, a compa, nighed by a linguist and a scribe. What he found was not a fraud or a heretic, but a quiet woman who lived in a stone cell surrounded by candles, scrolls, and silence. She wore no crown, held no title, and yet locals came from miles away just to touch her feet. Father Lorenzo recorded his time with her in a leather-bound journal now hidden deep in the Vatican archives. In it, he described her as possessing a spirit of divine clarity, unmatched by any nun or mystic I have encountered. He even witnessed what he called a healing beyond understanding. When Ababa laid her hands upon a dying child who opened his eyes moments later and said, "The fire has passed," what troubled the Vatican, however, was not her holiness. It was her knowledge. Abab spoke openly of visions involving the early church. She named apostles whose names had been scrubbed from canon. She claimed the first altar built after Christ's death was not in Rome, but in Axum, and she spoke of a black book buried beneath a ruined monastery, sealed with gold, guarded by silence. The Vatican's hesitation grew. In 1824, the Congregation for the Causes of Saints began her case, but it never reached completion. Documents went missing. A testimony was retracted, and Father Lorenzo, upon returning to Rome, fell mysteriously ill. He died before his final report could be delivered. Only a single page survived, discovered decades later, hidden in the lining of his traveling satchel. On it, a handwritten note read, "She was too close to the truth, not for our time, not yet." Baba's name was removed from the canonization records. But in the hills of Ethiopia, her story lives on. Her tomb is still visited by those who seek healing. Her cell remains untouched. And every year on the anniversary of her death, the bells of a small stone chapel ring without a hand to pull the rope. The Vatican no longer speaks her name. But in the shadowed corners of history, she is still remembered as the saint who nearly was. His name was Brother Matthias, a quiet man with a quiet job. For more than 30 years he worked in the Vatican's Archie Secretum, the private library of the popes, where only a few were allowed, and fewer still knew what truly lay beneath the dust. His task was simple on the surface: maintain the order of the sealed collections, monitor the climate of ancient parchments, and file any newly restricted volumes. He never questioned the titles, and no one questioned him. But in the final years of his service, Brother Matthias began to speak of dreams. At first he told only the night guard, then the janitor, dreams of mountains without names, stars that burned blue, and a voice that spoke. In a language he had never learned but somehow understood. He would wake with words on his tongue that sounded like thunder and wind, and each time the same message echoed in his mind: the flame is in the soil. One morning in the winter of 1978, Matthias arrived late. His eyes were red, his hands shook. He told the head archivist that he needed access to Vault C, one of the oldest and most protected rooms beneath the Vatican. That request alone raised suspicion. Vault C housed materials connected to early Christian sects deemed dangerous, heretical, or simply too strange to be included in the Church's story. Inside that vault was a red leather-bound codex, long forgotten, its pages too fragile to be copied, its origin raced back to a monastery in northern Ethiopia. It had no title, no author, only symbols, written in both GA and an older tongue, one the Vatican linguists never fully identified. The book had sat untouched for nearly a century until that day when Brother Matthias opened it without permission. Later, he would claim he was drawn to it. He told the supervising cardinal that the voice from his dreams had led him to a passage hidden between the lines. "Not just ink," he whispered, "but light. There is a message in the burn of the page." The cardinal dismissed him. The book was resealed. Matthias was removed from his post and quietly retired. But 3 weeks later, a new incident occurred. Security found him kneeling in the center of St. Peter's Square, barefoot, his robes torn. He was speaking aloud in gears, though no one knew how he had learned it. He repeated the same phrase again and again. "The book is not lost. The soil remembers." He vanished the next day. No trace, no letter, not even a farewell to his fellow brothers. The Vatican issued no statement. His name was quietly removed from the official directory of Vatican staff. But in the logbook of Vault C, still stored in ink on parchment, his signature remains. One line dated and signed in a trembling hand. "Matthias, for the light beneath the stone, no one has opened the book since." In the quiet corners of a stone chapel tucked deep within the Ethiopian highlands, a prayer is whispered not to a distant god, but to one who walked the earth with feet bare and breath warm. To the Ethiopian Church, Christ is not only divine but living flesh, mystery wrapped in skin, not metaphor. This idea, though ancient, sparked tremors through the walls of the Vatican long before the formal councils of Rome decided what could and could not be said about the nature of Christ. The Ethiopian faithful held to their own view. They believed that God had not merely taken a form, but had become form, not a symbol, not a mask, but a man in full bone, blood, and spirit alike. It was a belief passed not in doctrine, but in song, in story, in the scent of frankincense rising through carved stone halls. To the Western Church, this view was troubling. In the 4th and 5th centuries, theological arguments broke into fire. Councils were held. Debates grew loud. The Council of Chalcedon in the year 451 declared a strict formula. Christ was both fully God and fully man, two natures without confusion. But the Ethiopian Church did not attend that council. They held fast to what they had always believed, that Christ's divine and human nature were one, inseparable, not just joined, but indistinguishable. Rome called it heresy. The Vatican scholars filed reports. They marked Ethiopian theology as monophysite, a term used to label and isolate. But those closest to the Ethiopian monasteries knew better. What they found was not heresy, but a mystery too deep for tidy definitions. One such scholar, Father Emilianus, visited the monastery of Deberdamo in the year 1927. He returned with a carved icon of Christ, different from any he had seen before. The eyes were gentle but dark, the skin warm and earthen, the robes unfamiliar in pattern. He looked not like a Roman, Emilianus wrote in his journal, but like a man of the land, and still I could not look away. What disturbed the Vatican most was not the image, but the power behind it. These were not idle paintings. They were living theology, born not of councils, but of contact passed from father to son, from priest to child, in stories too old to trace. A Vatican official, after reviewing Emilianus's findings, issued a private note. "Their Christ is not ours. He does not answer to Rome." That sentence was never meant to be seen beyond the archives, but a copy survived, tucked into the back of a forgotten report. It sits now in a drawer, yellow with age, its meaning still sharp, for in the folds of Ethiopia's worship lies a question the Vatican never fully answered. What if the mystery of Christ was not in understanding him, but in not trying to explain him at all? In the golden hills of northern Ethiopia, long before microphones and marble cathedrals, there was a whisper that turned into a belief, and that belief into a story. It was the story of a Christ who was not two, but three, not simply man and God as the Church in Rome had carefully declared, but something older and more mysterious, divine, human, and spiritual, braided together in a way that could not be undone. To the Ethiopian monks, this idea was not new. It was woven into their chants, carved into their crosses, hidden between the lines of ancient gaze manuscripts. It was not rebellion, it was reverence, a mystery too large for Rome's categories. But in the Vatican, this quiet belief struck a chord of fear. During the Council of Chalcedon in the year 451, the Roman Church had locked the doctrine in place. Christ had two natures, not one, not three. It was written in stone. To say otherwise was heresy. And yet Ethiopia did not attend that council. They kept their tradition untouched, their own sacred texts unchanged, and within those texts lay the idea that Christ held a third essence, not just divine and human, but a Holy Spirit that moved between, beyond, and within. A young Jesuit scholar named Aurelius Danti was one of the first to record this belief after a secret mission to Ethiopia in the year 1924. His notes, never published but stored in the Vatican's restricted files, speak of a conversation with a monk at the edge of Lake Tana. The monk had looked him in the eye and said, "To know Chris, T.U. must meet him not as two halves, but as a whole mystery." That phrase haunted Dante. In his personal journal, he confessed confusion, even fear. "Their faith is not broken," he wrote. "It is deeper than ours, but it is not ours." Dante's report triggered a quiet alarm in the Vatican. The idea of a third nature, a spirit nature, did not align with Western theology. It suggested something living, breathing, evolving, something uncontrolled. The Vatican feared what this could inspire. Not long after, a memo was circulated among high-ranking cardinals. It warned of a growing interest in Ethiopian texts and urged restrictions on all research into the so-called three natures heresy. The term stuck even though no Ethiopian priest had ever used it. But in truth, the idea was never about heresy. It was about wonder, a different way of seeing Christ, not through lines and laws, but through mystery, song, and silence. And though the Vatican locked those documents away, the story still lives in carved churches, in whispered prayers, and in manuscripts hidden where the sunlight touches only once a year. And so the question remains, soft but unshaken. What if the truth the Vatican feared was never false, only unfamiliar? In a quiet chapel tucked behind the high stone walls of the Ethiopian College in Rome, there once hung a painting that no one spoke of. It was not listed in any guidebook. Tourists were never shown the room. Even most priests passed it without knowing, but those who saw it never forgot. The image was striking not for its size, but for its silence. It showed Christ seated on a carved wooden throne, his feet resting on a cushion of clouds. Around him, golden light flickered through delicate brushstrokes. But it was not the throne or the gold or even the clouds that stirred unease. It was his face. Christ was painted as a black man, his skin a deep brown, his eyes wide and calm, his hair tightly curled, his presence neither angry nor soft, but still as if waiting. The artist had captured something ancient, something both regal and human. The painting was said to have been created in the early 1600s, brought from Axum to Rome by an Ethiopian priest named Father Tekler Monote. He carried it in a wooden box, wrapped in linen and prayer. At first it was placed with respect inside the small chapel, but decades later, after a shift in papal leadership, it was quietly removed. No explanation was ever given. The Vatican never condemned the image outright. There were no official statements, no public orders, but behind closed doors, rumors spread. Some whispered that the painting challenged too much, that it touched on questions the Church was not ready to face. Because if Christ had been seen and worshipped as black by entire Christian nations for centuries, what did that mean for the story Western Europe had told? What did it mean for the icons lining the halls of St. Peter's Basilica, for the pale marble statues, for the history that had shaped empires and justified power? It is said that in the year 1942, during the turmoil of war, the painting was removed altogether. A Vatican librarian later wrote in a journal entry marked private that it had been placed in storage below the Archim's secret, not destroyed, simply hidden. But not all stories stay hidden. In the early 2000s, a photograph surfaced, just one of the painting. A scholar claimed it had been taken in the 1970s by a visiting Ethiopian monk. The Vatican never confirmed its authenticity, but those who had seen the original said the photo was real, the same face, the same eyes. And so the mystery remains. Was the vision of Christ as a black man too different or simply too true? Perhaps the greater fear was not the image itself, but the silence that followed, the questions it asked without words, and the history it held in plain view. In a city built on sacred tradition, sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones hidden not in darkness, but in daylight behind a locked door. The fire was small, but the paper burned fast. It happened late at night in the garden behind the apostolic palace. A servant holding the torch was told to look away. A cardinal watched in silence, and the man who gave the order, he stood with his hands folded, his face pale in the moonlight. He was the Pope. Not every secret in the Vatican is buried beneath stone. Some are turned to ash. The document in question was not. Long, fewer than 50 pages bound in rough leather, the text written in a careful hand. But what it said, what it dared to say, made it dangerous. It spoke of visions, of prophecy, and of a theology that did not match what Rome had declared holy. It told of a Christ, not only seen in human form, but one who walked among the poor in Ethiopia, who spoke in the ancient tongue of Ges, and who named as saints those never known to the Western world. The Pope who ordered its destruction was not known for rage. He was a quiet man, thoughtful, private, but something in the text must have shaken him. Some say it was a passage that claimed the Church had taken the wrong path 1,000 years ago. Others believe it was a name, a long-forgotten Ethiopian monk whose teachings mirrored those of the early apostles more closely than anything in the Roman canon. Whatever it was, it crossed a line, not the line of heresy alone, but something deeper, something older, a challenge to the very foundation of control. The fire consumed the book in less than 10 minutes, but not completely. Unknown to the Pope, one of the Vatican archivists had made a copy, handwritten, page by page. He had not done it out of rebellion, but out of awe. He believed the words were holy. He believed they should not be forgotten. He hid the copy in a scroll case, sealing it behind a false panel in a small chapel outside the city. That chapel is no longer used. It was closed in the 1950s after a lightning strike damaged the roof. But the panel, it is said, remains. What frightened the Pope was not fire or even the fear of discovery. It was what the book made possible. A different story, a different Christ, a church not centered in Rome but in the highlands of Africa, where stone churches held voices that did not echo the Vatican's teachings. In the Vatican, silence can be louder than bells, and when something is burned, it is not always erased. Sometimes fire is only the beginning of the story. It was small, no larger than a dinner plate, framed in dark wood and wrapped in linen. It arrived at the Vatican quietly, like many relics do. There was no parade, no announcement, only a single monk from the Ethiopian highlands who walked the last mile barefoot, carrying the painting as though it were a living thing. He spoke little Latin, just enough to say, "This belongs to both of you now." The painting showed the Madonna and Child, but not in the usual European style. The skin was dark, the eyes deep and almond-shaped, and the robes rich in color, gold, crimson, and indigo. The Christ Child held a scroll, not a cross, and in the background were faint hills that looked nothing like Bethlehem. They looked like the mountains of northern Ethiopia. It was hung in a side chapel near the rear of the basilica. Few noticed it at first. There were no signs, no plaques, just a painting set between candles left to be discovered by wandering pilgrims and silent priests. But within a month, whispers began. A custodian was the first to report it. He claimed the eyes moved, not suddenly, not in a ghostly way, but slowly, as if they followed those who passed too closely. Then came the priest who found drops on the floor beneath it, small, clear, and sticky, like tears. He wiped them away, but the next day they returned. A group of scholars was called in. They examined the frame, the pigments, the surface. Nothing strange, no tricks, no chemicals. The linen behind the painting was clean and dry, but the moisture kept returning. One afternoon, during a quiet mass, a nun sitting in the second pew gasped. The painting, she said, had wept. Right before her eyes she saw it, not imagined, not dreamed. The tears ran down the Madonna's cheeks and vanished before they touched the frame. That night, the painting was taken down, not destroyed, not returned. It was hidden. No formal statement was made, no mention in the archives, but a guard assigned to the papal residence that evening overheard a heated conversation behind a closed door. The Pope was not angry, he was frightened. Ed, if word gets out, he said, we will lose the center. The painting was said to come from a monastery founded in the 5th century. It had hung over an altar where pilgrims prayed in G, the ancient tongue the Vatican could never fully control. And the scroll in the child's hand, according to the monk, was not from the Gospel of Luke or Matthew. It was from the Book of Enoch, a book that Rome had locked away. The Vatican keeps many things behind closed doors, but this painting, simple and quiet, left an echo that has never faded. Some say it still weeps even now behind stone in the silence where faith and fear meet. In the spring of 1935, dark clouds gathered over Africa, and Rome watched in silence. At the heart of that silence stood two powerful men. One wore a white cassock and spoke only in public blessings. The other wore a black uniform, shouted from balconies, and promised to restore an empire. Pope Pius X, XI, and Benito Mussolini never stood side by side, yet they shared more than geography. They shared secrets. When Mussolini prepared to invade Ethiopia, the Vatican did not raise its voice. There were no public condemnations, no sermons of peace. Instead, there were private meetings, unchronicled visits between envoys and priests, meetings held behind the heavy doors of the Apostolic Palace. The invasion began in October of 1935. Airplanes dropped poison gas, churches were bombed, monasteries burned, and still St. Peter's Square remained quiet. It was not because the Vatican approved of the violence. No, but Ethiopia's version of Christianity, its ancient books, its long memory, its claim to the Ark of the Covenant, was seen as a dangerous parallel, one too close to Rome, one that had survived without it. One document, later uncovered in the margins of a diplomatic file, hints at a chilling logic. A handwritten note beside a typed report from a papal advisor reads, "If the libraries burn, we will never have to answer for what we did not teach." That single sentence says much. For centuries, the Vatican had shaped history through sacred texts. But in Ethiopia, those texts told a different story. The Queen of Sheba had visited Jerusalem. Her son, Menelik, took the Ark. The Ethiopian Bible held books Rome had rejected, and through it, all their priests spoke in GES, a language older than Latin, untouched by councils in Europe. Mussolini wanted an empire. The Vatican wanted control of the narrative, their goals aligned. But not everyone agreed. A young bishop stationed in Florence began writing letters. In them, he questioned the silence from Rome. He quoted the book of Isaiah and warned of judgment. His final letter, dated March of 1937, was returned unopened. Shortly after, he was reassigned to a small village and never published again. Years later, a Jesuit archivist found a sealed envelope tucked behind a file in the Vatican library. Inside was a photograph. It showed Ethiopian monks standing in the ruins of a church holding fragments of a manuscript. Written across the top in faded ink were the words, "They tried to erase us." The Vatican never denied its silence, but it never explained it either. That silence lingers. In the gardens behind St. Peter's Basilica, there is a small plaque weathered and overlooked. It bears no name, just a date, October 3rd, 1935, and a single line of scripture, "Woe unto them that call evil good." A line chosen not for the world, but perhaps for the Church itself. In the dim light of the Vatican's archival wing, far from the echoing halls of St. Peter's Basilica, there is a drawer that has no official listing. Its label is blank. Its key is held by no one living, and inside, according to whispered accounts from retired clerks, are the Haile Selassie files. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia was not just a political leader. He was seen by his people as a sacred monarch, the 225th direct descendant of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. To the Vatican, he represented something even more dangerous, a sovereign ruler who upheld a Christian tradition older than Rome's own. When the Italian invasion of Ethiopia ended in 1936, Selassie was forced into exile. But in those years abroad, he spoke more loudly than ever before. In Geneva, before the League of Nations, he stood in regal silence and then delivered a speech that haunted the Vatican's corridors. He warned of judgment. He spoke of justice. He invoked God, not the God of Latin rites, but the ancient God of Ethiopia. It was not just politics, it was prophecy. One priest assigned to diplomatic observation at the time, Father Leone Marini, kept meticulous notes of the speech. His report, marked confidential and sent directly to the Secretariat of State, contained an unexpected line. "This man does not beg for help. He speaks as if he knows how the story ends." After Mussolini fell and Selassie returned to his throne, Rome grew nervous. Vatican envoys were sent. Under diplomatic cover, some were told to offer reconciliation. Others were instructed only to listen and to watch. What they found surprised them. Ethiopian scribes were preserving prophecies never translated into Latin. One text, described in a lost Jesuit letter, claimed that a time would come when the Empire of the West would wear the robes of the East and forget where it began. That letter was never published, but it was logged, then sealed. The most disturbing part came in 1949, when Haile Selassie sent a gift to the Pope, a bound codex in gaze, handwritten by desert monks, said to contain visions seen by the emperor himself. It was never displayed, it was never acknowledged, but an internal Vatican memo from that year references a book of signs received from Ethiopia, now locked in the Archum Secretum due to the nature of its contents and the uncertainty of its origin. Years past the files remained unopened. In 1975, shortly after Selassie's mysterious death under house arrest, a note was added to the file. It was written in red pencil, the same used by senior Vatican archivists. It read, "Do not destroy, do not discuss, await the end of the century." No one knows who wrote that line, and perhaps more hauntingly, no one has dared to erase it. In the spring of 1936, inside the hushed chambers of the Vatican, a strange silence settled like dust upon the marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica. It was not the quiet of reverence or prayer, but the kind of silence that follows a storm one did not see coming. That storm came not from Rome, but from Geneva, where a man dressed in regal Ethiopian robes stood alone before the League of Nations. Emperor Haile Selassie, exiled from his homeland by Mussolini's invasion, stood tall before the world's leaders. But his words were not merely for them. They were, according to one Vatican diplomat in Athens, dance aimed directly at Rome, not just the government, but the Holy See itself. Selassie's voice, calm and unwavering, carried with it a warning that transcended politics. He spoke of justice, of faith, and of the ancient covenant between his people and their God. He did not plead, he did not bargain. Instead, he declared that Ethiopia had kept the faith of Solomon while the West had forgotten it. He reminded them all that Ethiopia had embraced Christianity before Rome ever claimed the cross. The Vatican had sent Bishop Armand del Valle to observe. He was a quiet man, known more for his translations of ancient Syriac texts than for diplomacy. But what he witnessed that day would shake him. In his private report he wrote, "It was not a speech, it was scripture." And indeed it felt as if the words had been carried from some older, holier time. That night, The echo of the emperor's voice reached the marble halls of St. Peter's Basilica, though he had never stepped foot inside. Monsignors whispered of the speech. Cardinals debated it behind closed doors. The Pope's advisors feared it would inspire a re-evaluation of Ethiopia's Christian claims, especially as Rome's own alliances with fascist Italy became harder to explain. What unnerved them most was not just the content of the speech, but a line that had been left out of the official transcript. A line spoken quietly, almost as if meant for ears beyond the room. According to Bishop Del Vecchio, the emperor had ended by saying, "The Lion of Judah still watches from the mountains, and his roar is not forgotten." That phrase, an ancient reference to both the Solomonic dynasty and biblical prophecy, sparked panic among some Vatican historians. One noted in the margins of the report, "If true, we must reconsider what we call apostolic." The Pope, upon reading the report, gave no public statement, but 3 days later, access to the Ethiopian wing of the Vatican Library was restricted without explanation, and Bishop Del Vecchio was reassigned to a quiet post in northern Spain, where he would never publish again. The speech, while forgotten by many in the world, was never truly forgotten within the Vatican. Its echoes still move softly through the corridors, carried not by wind, but by memory and by fear of a truth that Rome cannot control. Late one evening in the summer of 1936, the lamps flickered low in the passageways beneath Vatican City. The cobbled floor beneath St. Peter's Square had seen many secrets walk its length: bishops with forbidden books, archivists carrying locked crates, and cardinals with thoughts they could never say aloud. But that night, the quiet was broken by the boots of the Swiss Guard, echoing like a warning down the old stone corridor. It was just after the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, had delivered his powerful speech in Geneva. Whispers of his words had reached the Holy See like smoke curling through cracks in a door. Some said his speech had unsettled more than the Pope. Some said it had awakened something in the archives below. A guard named Matthias Ulrich, just 22 years old, was stationed at the eastern entrance to the Archie-Secretum. He was new, eager, curious, and that night, according to a report buried in the guard logs, he saw a man in black robes attempting to enter the restricted vaults. The man carried no identification and did not speak, but he held something in his hand, a small, gold-edged volume wrapped in red cloth. The guard asked him to halt. The man did not. Ulrich raised his halberd. And then the man vanished, not turned and fled, not ducked into a side hall. He vanished, as if the shadows themselves had taken him in. The young guard sounded the alarm. Within moments, 4 others arrived. A search was ordered. Every corridor beneath the Apostolic Palace was swept, every door checked. But no man was found. Only a single item remained, left on the ground where Ulrich had last seen the figure. A ring, brass, inscribed with a single word in Gu's script. No one could read it. What followed was silence. The incident was never formally written into Vatican history. But weeks later, 2 things happened. First, Ulrich was removed from his post, transferred without ceremony to a remote basilica in the hills outside Milan. Second, a set of unmarked crates arrived from the Ethiopian College and were moved without record into a hidden section of the archive. Years later, a senior archivist confessed over wine and candlelight that the Vatican had long feared not a war of armies, but a war of truths. That night in 1936, he claimed, was not about a guard seeing something strange. It was about a door the Vatican thought it had locked, forever opening again. To this day, the Swiss Guard never speak of it. The ring was never catalogued, and the Vatican has never explained why. For 3 days after that night, the doors of the Archive Secretum were sealed, guarded by 12 men with loaded rifles, while the bells of St. Peter's did not ring. In a quiet room deep within the Vatican museums, behind thick glass and under the dull glow of soft white light, sits an artifact that no one was ever meant to see. It is a small gold cross, delicate and strange, placed at the back of a private collection known only to a handful of curators. According to the Official records. It arrived during the chaos of the Second World War, donated anonymously by a European collector. But the story behind it is far older and far more troubling. The cross does not resemble any Roman or European style. Its arms curve outward like branches ending in patterns shaped like flames or feathers. On one side is a circle of Amharic script, on the other, an engraving of a lion with wings. But the most startling feature is what lies at the center, a gemstone cut into the shape of an eye, red as blood, smooth as glass. It is not native to Europe or even the Holy Land. Experts traced its origin to the Ethiopian highlands near the ancient city of Axum. The Vatican knew this symbol. It matched one found in the margins of the Book of Enoch, in a version only preserved in Ethiopia. The eye, they believed, represented divine judgment, the seeing eye of the watchers. For centuries, the Church had declared those stories heretical, buried and forgotten. Yet here it was in gold, on a relic carried across continents and time. But the real mystery began when a scholar attempted to study it. In the year 1973, a young Jesuit historian named Father Leone was granted brief access to the restricted room. He spent hours sketching the cross, translating what he could. What he wrote down has never been released in full, but parts of his journal were leaked by a former student many years later. According to the notes, the inscription on the cross included a date long before the Me of Christ, and a phrase that translated to, "The covenant was taken south, taken, not lost." That one line caused alarm within the archives. If true, it would mean the cross was linked not just to Ethiopian tradition, but to something more sacred, something Roman Catholicism had long denied. The suggestion was clear. The Ark of the Covenant, or a piece of it, had traveled to Ethiopia, and this cross, this strange ancient gold symbol, was its marker. Within days, Father Leon's research was halted. The cross was returned behind glass. Leon himself was reassigned to a mission in Argentina and never spoke publicly again. The Vatican labeled the translation inconclusive and advised silence, but silence has a weight of its own, and those who have seen the cross in person say that on certain days the gemstone at its center seems to glow faintly, as if something inside it remembers, as if it is still watching. In the grand halls of the Vatican, there are certain truths that are never spoken aloud. They are not printed in textbooks, not taught in seminaries, and not whispered among the faithful. One of these truths is about a schism. Not the great schism of the East and West, not the Reformation of Martin, Luther, but another break, one that was never declared, never documented, and yet quietly changed the course of Christian history. It happened not with swords, nor with fiery sermons. It unfolded in letters never sent, in visits never announced, and in agreements that dissolved in candle-lit chambers. This was the separation between the Roman Church and the ancient Ethiopian Church, a divide so deep and silent that most never knew it had happened. Long before Rome solidified its authority, Ethiopia practiced its own ancient form of Christianity. Rooted in Jewish customs, rich in Hebrew traditions, and guided by texts that the Vatican later labeled apocryphal, the Ethiopian faith grew in the mountains and deserts, hidden from Roman eyes. And, for centuries, the Vatican watched uneasy. In the early 1600s, the Jesuits were sent to Ethiopia not just as missionaries, but as enforcers. Their task was to align the Ethiopian faith with Roman doctrine. They offered gifts, flattered kings, and conducted secret debates with monks in candlelit monasteries. But Ethiopia did not bend. Their priests refused to remove the Book of Enoch. They would not deny the humanity of Mary. They would not replace their chants with Latin hymns. When diplomacy failed, silence followed. A letter from a cardinal in the year 1639, found in a private archive in Avignon, tells of the great grief the Holy See suffered at the loss of the Highland Brethren. But the letter was never officially recorded. No excommunication was issued, no public statement was made. Rome simply stopped mentioning Ethiopia, as if ignoring a wound could heal it. But Ethiopia remembered. In one monastery near Lake Tana, a carved wooden door bears an image of a lion turning its back on a two-headed eagle. The monks say it was made after the last Jesuit left the highlands. The lion, they claim, represents the house of Judah, the eagle the power of Rome. The carving is not angry, it is sad, a quiet farewell. And yet, hidden in the Vatican archives, there is evidence the separation was never truly forgotten. A restricted folder labeled simply Ethiopia contains references to meetings, translations, and sealed documents. Most were never opened again. Some say a pope once tried to mend the rift. Others say the fear of what Ethiopia knew, what books they kept, what truths they refused to erase was too great. So the schism was never public, but it was real, and it lingers, quiet as a shadow, between two great churches that once shared a beginning but chose different endings. In the year 1647, under the heavy sun of the Ethiopian highlands, a priest named Father Tess stood at the threshold of a stone chapel carved into the side of a mountain. He was dressed in simple white linen, his cross carved from olive wood. Waiting for him at the edge of the clearing were two men in black, Jesuits from Rome sent to offer him a choice. They came with promises, education, protection, gold, and the favor of the Pope. They brought letters sealed with red wax, signed by cardinals. They said Rome wished to embrace him to make him a bridge between two churches. All he had to do was renounce the older teachings, close the Book of Enoch, and accept the authority of the Holy See. But Father Tesfaye did not move. The men waited. One of them, a younger Jesuit with tired eyes, opened a leather-bound codex and read aloud from the Roman canon. He recited verses that had been removed from Ethiopian liturgy centuries earlier. Then he read a list, books Rome had banned but Ethiopia still read. Jubilees, the Book of Mary, the story of the Watchers. When the reciting stopped, Tess spoke. He said, "That scripture was not a wall but a well, that water flows from many places, not just Rome." He told them the mountain they stood on had been a place of worship before Latin was even spoken, that the angels did not speak only in Rom's tongue, and that God had not asked him to choose. The older Jesuit grew angry. He warned Tess that defiance was heresy, that his refusal could be considered rebellion. He reminded him of other priests who had vanished, of churches that were quietly sealed. He asked if Tess was willing to risk not just his life, but his soul. Tess looked toward the valley. Smoke rose from nearby villages where Jesuit missions had already replaced sacred texts. His people were afraid, not of war, but of silence, of losing the words that had shaped their prayers for 1,000 years. So he answered, "I was baptized with water from a stone basin that sits above an angel's tomb." He said, "I have kissed manuscripts that glow in the candlelight and held a cross that bled in the snow. I do not fear the Vatican. I fear forgetting who we are." That night the Jesuits left without a word. A few weeks later, the chapel was found empty. No signs of struggle, no footprints in the dust, just a single page left on the altar, its ink still wet. It read, "The truth does not bend. It waits." To this day, Father Tesfaye's name is missing from every Vatican record, but in a monastery far from Rome, his story is still told, not as a tale of rebellion, but as a reminder. Some priests do not vanish. Some simply walk deeper into the mystery and leave the door open behind them. By the quiet northern wall of the Vatican, tucked just behind the colonnades of St. Peter's Square, stands a building most visitors walk past without a glance. Its stone walls are warm from the Roman sun, its windows always shuttered, and its doors never open to tourists. This is the Pontifical Ethiopian College, the spiritual home for a handful of Ethiopian priests who have studied within the Vatican's walls for centuries. But beneath its chapel, hidden beneath layers of stone and silence, there is a room that does not appear on any official map. The room was not always a secret. In the late 1800s, when the college was newly expanded, workers stumbled upon a narrow staircase sealed with a wooden door. The priest, overseeing the construction, a man named Abba Johannes, instructed them not to open it until he had spoken to the Vatican library. But by morning, the workers were gone. Not dismissed, gone. No records, no forwarding addresses, not even a wage slip left behind. Years later, a young student named Daniel was sent to sweep the lower crypts. It was a punishment for speaking openly about books that were not approved for his studies, including the Kebra Nagast and the Book of Enoch. As he dusted along the rough stones, he noticed a hollow sound beneath one of the flagstones. When he lifted it, he found a rusted key tied to a leather cord. The tag read, "Only one word, Abba." He brought the key to his teacher, who stared at it for a long time before leading him silently to a door hidden behind a tapestry of St. Fermentius. The lock clicked once. The door groaned open, and what lay beyond was not a storage room. It was a library, small, round, and carved into the earth itself. The room was lined with wooden shelves built into the stone. On them rested scrolls, some too brittle to touch, others rolled tight in animal hide. There were books bound in palm leaves and written in languages that had long since died. In the center, beneath a single shaft of light from a hole in the ceiling, sat a wooden desk. On it, open and exposed to the air, lay a manuscript no one could date. The ink was dark red, the letters neither Gear nor Latin. Some believed it was written before the fall of Axum. Others said it was a translation of a scroll taken from Jerusalem before the Roman siege. Daniel was never seen again. When the door was opened years later, the manuscript was gone, but etched into the stone above the desk. Someone had carved 7 words. They buried the light so it would burn. The Vatican has never acknowledged the room's existence, but those who live inside the college sometimes speak of dreams, of voices that echo from beneath the floor, whispering in a tongue no one remembers yet everyone understands. In a quiet reading room deep within the Vatican library, where the air always smells faintly of parchment and old incense, there lies a book unlike any other. It is stored in a locked drawer inside a plain wooden desk, far from the golden halls and polished marble that most visitors imagine. Its cover is worn, its pages crumbling at the corners. Yet what lies within has kept scholars awake at night for generations. The text is not in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or even the ancient tongue of Gu. The symbols drift across the page like music, not letters. Some look like stars, others resemble flames, and between them faint lines suggest movement as if the script breathes. The book has no title, no known author, and no record of how it came to rest within Vatican walls. But according to a single, handwritten note tucked inside, it is believed to be written in the language of the angels. That phrase alone has caused trouble. In the 17th century, an ambitious Jesuit named Father Niccolo Renal came upon the book while cataloguing unmarked volumes. He recognized nothing in it, but something about the ink disturbed him. When he held the page to the candlelight, the words shimmered, only briefly and only in his peripheral vision. He brought the book to his superior, who dismissed it as a local forgery. But Raldi could not let it go. For weeks he worked by lamplight, trying to copy the symbols onto fresh parchment. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that if angels spoke, their words would follow the rules of mathematics. He mapped out patterns, counted shapes, even prayed aloud over the pages. And then one night something changed. Raldi was found at dawn, collapsed on the marble floor of the reading room. He was still alive, but could no longer speak. His fingers were stained black from ink, and he clutched a scrap of paper to his chest. On it were only 3 words written in a careful, terrified hand. "They answered me. He never wrote again." After that, the Vatican sealed the book away. Some say it was locked beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Others claim it was moved to the Apostolic Archive, far below ground, where even cardinals need permission to enter. Only a few cryptographers have seen it since, and none have successfully translated even a single line. But one mystery remains. According to Vatican records, the ink used in the manuscript is not from any known source, animal, plant, or mineral. It contains no iron, no dye, no ash. Under ultraviolet light, it glows softly like moonlight on water. Some whisper that the text was not written but sung into being, that it came not from a prophet, but from a voice heard in the dark, a language not meant to be read but be felt, and those who feel it never forget it. Late one night in the spring of 1954, a strange silence fell over Vatican City. It was not the silence of peace or prayer, but the kind that creeps in when something is not quite right. The usual hum of Vatican radio, a station known for its smooth Latin hymns and distant bells, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. The priest who had been speaking, Father Leone Recci, never finished his line. For nearly 10 seconds there was nothing but static. Then came a sound no one could explain. Those who were listening at that exact moment claimed it began as a low hum, rising into a sharp whistle. It crackled across the frequency like wind through a narrow corridor. But then beneath it came something stranger, a voice or something like one. Not Italian, not Latin, and certainly not a known language. The tone was soft, almost whispered, but layered like multiple voices speaking at once, as though someone or something was trying to come through. Father Recci did not return to the microphone that night. In fact, he vanished entirely. The official explanation was simple. Technical failure. Vatican engineers issued a public statement the next morning saying a fuse had blown in the station's transmitter tower, causing interference with local frequencies. But several radio hobbyists outside of Rome claimed they recorded the incident, and one of them, a retired technician named Giorgio Vanni, brought his realtor tape to a university professor in Milan. The professor, an expert in early Semitic languages, listened closely. After a long pause, he stood up and left the room without saying a word. He refused to comment further, but he did publish a brief paper later that year about non-linear vocal patterns found in ancient liturgies of Eastern Africa. In private, Giorgio said the voice had repeated a phrase over and over. He believed it was gaze, the ancient liturgical tongue still used by the Ethiopian Church. And though he could not understand it, one word stood out, again and again, Menelik. The Vatican never addressed the rumor, but a week after the broadcast, 2 Jesuit officials were sent to Ethiopia under diplomatic cover. Their mission was never logged publicly, and Father Recci, the priest who had disappeared during the broadcast, was never heard from again. Some say he walked into the apostolic library days before the event, carrying a box of manuscripts recently arrived from East Africa. Others claim he had been studying forbidden texts tied to the Kebra Nagast and may have made a connection the Church did not want revealed. The Vatican radio tower has never suffered an interruption like that since, but every now and then on the anniversary of that night, amateur radio operators tune in to the same frequency and listen closely. Sometimes, when the wind is right, they say the hum returns, not loud, not clear, but there, just enough to make you wonder who or what was trying to speak. In the stillness beneath Rome, far below the bustling streets and candle-lit halls of Vatican City, there lies a vast network of catacombs, dark, narrow tunnels carved out centuries ago, long before the basilicas and marble thrones of popes. These were once hiding places for the early Christians, graves and shrines tucked away from the eyes of emperors. But one of these tunnels holds a mystery far stranger than bones. In the spring of 1926, a group of Vatican workmen was tasked with reinforcing a lower section of the catacombs near the old Aeon Way. One of them, a quiet man named Petro Duca, swung his pickaxe against what he thought was a soft patch of earth. Instead, the wall gave way to a narrow sealed chamber. The air that escaped was thick with age and the scent of damp parchment. Inside the chamber was a stone shelf, and on it a small scroll bound in faded red thread. Unlike the brittle Latin texts nearby, this scroll was wrapped in layers of cloth that had somehow resisted decay. A metal cross, oddly shaped and unlike any used in Western Christianity, had been pressed into the covering like a seal. Petro, startled, reported the find to his supervisor, who in turn contacted the office of the archivist. Within hours, a black car arrived from the Vatican, and the scroll was taken away. Pro never saw it again. He was reassigned to landscaping work on the Vatican grounds and quietly retired 2 years later. But the story did not end with him. Decades later, in 1973, a researcher named Sister Antella, who specialized in early church writings, found a single uncatalogued entry in a leather-bound inventory book inside the Apostolic Archive. It listed a scroll of unknown origin described as Eastern, untranslatable, and preserved by unknown means. No language was noted, but beside the entry were two words underlined in faded ink: Gara and fireproof. Sister Antella became obsessed with this scroll. She believed it might be connected to the Abaima Gospels, ancient Ethiopian texts said to have been written in a single day by a saint guided by angels. What troubled her was the mention of fireproofing. For scent, Uri's only two things were believed to survive: flames unscorched, holy, relics and curses. The Vatican never admitted to possessing such a scroll, and shortly after Sister Antella requested to view it, her research privileges were revoked. No explanation was given. Some whisper the scroll contains a forgotten gospel, one that tells of a second covenant hidden from Rome. Others say it speaks of a time when Christ walked in lands unrecorded by the West, and some believe it was not meant to be found at all. Even now, deep under the marble halls, the catacombs remain untouched, and somewhere in the dark, beyond the sealed chamber, a secret may still be waiting, written not in Latin or Greek, but in a language older than either, a message meant for someone who has not yet come. In the quiet stillness of the Vatican gardens, hidden behind layers of vines and old stone, there is a small, forgotten chapel that no longer hosts visitors. Few even know it exists. It has no name on record, no entry in public maps, and its doors have not been opened to pilgrims in over 100 years. But behind its crumbling walls lies one of the strangest sights ever discovered within Vatican territory, a wall painted entirely in symbols no one can read. The chapel was first documented in the late 1800s by a young archivist named Father Emilio Carrazza. He was cataloging lesser-known religious structures around St. Peter's Square when he came upon a faded drawing in the margin of an older architect's notebook. The chapel was marked simply as Cappella de Segni, the Chapel of Signs. When Father Alio found the location, he expected dust, cobwebs, and silence. He was not prepared for what he saw inside. From floor to ceiling, the inner wall behind the altar was painted in symbols that defied all known alphabets: spirals, stars with uneven arms, lines that curled and split into branches like roots or rivers. There were no crosses, no halos, no human figures, only shapes. Some glowed faintly in candlelight, as if made from a pigment no longer used. Others were barely visible until viewed from a sharp angle, revealing layers beneath the paint. He quickly reported his discovery. Within a week, 2 scholars from the Pontifical Academy arrived. They stayed for 3 days and left without saying a word. Father Amelio asked for updates, but received none. Then the chapel was closed, padlocked, its key filed away in the secret archive. Father Emilio was transferred to a post in Milan. But curiosity has a strange way of echoing through time. In 1977, a Jesuit mathematician named Brother Rafael Ibarra came across an old photo of the wall in a discarded archive box. He ran the symbols through cryptographic software he had built for decoding Inuit texts. The software crashed, not once, but every time it reached a certain portion of the wall. This was not random data. It followed patterns, but patterns not of letters or numbers. What disturbed him more was a hand-drawn overlay he found folded behind the photo. Someone had traced portions of the wall and compared them to petroglyphs found in the highlands of Ethiopia near Libella. The match was not exact, but it was close enough to raise suspicion. Was it possible the symbols were not meant to be read at all, that they were meant to be felt, to be prayed into? In 2003, a linguist visiting the Vatican under special permission claimed the wall Paul said faintly when she stood before it in silence. Her findings were never published, and the Vatican refused to comment. Some believe the wall contains a forgotten language of angels. Others believe it is a map, a warning, or a prayer for something that has not yet come. But no one, not even the Vatican itself, can say for certain what the symbols mean, and maybe that is exactly how they want it to stay. It began with whispers not from cardinals or chambers, but from dreams. In the winter of 1954, Pope Pius XII began waking with strange phrases etched into his memory. They were not Latin, not Italian, not any language he recognized. He first thought them nonsense, mere fragments from the fog of sleep. But night after night the words returned, clearer, fuller, always spoken in the same voice, not a whisper, but a chant, deep and distant, like monks in a stone corridor. At first he told no one, but silence in the Vatican is often loud in its own way. His personal secretary noticed changes. The Pope would spend more time alone in the Apostolic Palace, staring out the window as if waiting for something to arrive from the horizon. He would mumble words under his breath, words that did not belong to any known tongue in Rome. Then came the letter. A monk from the Ethiopian highlands had sent it months earlier, but it had sat misfiled, unopened, until a Vatican librarian delivered it by accident. The parchment was old, the ink nearly faded, but the script was unmistakable. Gees, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia. As the Pope unfolded the letter, something stirred inside him. A recognition, a memory not his own. He could read it line by line, word by word, as though he had spoken it all his life. But how? No pope before had ever studied Guz. No classes in the Vatican schools taught it, and yet he understood it. That night, the dreams changed. Instead of only words, he began to see places, desert chapels carved from red rock, scrolls glowing in dim candle, light. A voice would speak, not in command but in warning. Protect the book, guard the line, do not let Rome forget. The dreams troubled him so deeply that he summoned a delegation from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church under full secrecy. No record was kept, no press release followed. The meeting took place beneath St. Peter's Basilica, far from curious ears. One of the Ethiopian priests, an old man with clouded eyes and a voice like gravel, recited a chant in gaze. As he finished, the Pope repeated it back perfectly. None spoke for a long time. The priest finally nodded and handed the Pope a small wrapped parcel. Inside was a fragment of parchment said to be copied from the Book of Enoch, preserved only in Ethiopia. It contained a prophecy that had never appeared in any European Bible. According to the prophecy, one day a Roman shepherd would dream in the tongue of the East, and when he did, the lost line of David would be near to rising. The Pope never spoke publicly about the encounter. The dream stopped shortly after, but in the archives, sealed beneath layers of permissions, lies a single handwritten note in the Pope's own script. It is not our book, but theirs. And yet I understand every word. The bells of Vatican City rang softly that morning, not in celebration, but in mourning. Yet no one gathered. No crowd pressed against the ancient iron gates. No cardinals lined the path. No sea lifted its voice. It was a funeral. Without mourners, a burial whispered into silence. The man being laid to rest was not a pope nor a bishop. His name was Abba Lemma, an Ethiopian scholar who had once walked the quiet halls of the Vatican Library like a shadow, barefoot, soft-spoken, and often mistaken for a janitor. Yet within the stone walls of the archives, those who knew him called him the Walking Codex, because his memory held verses no book had ever recorded. And more than that, he carried knowledge the Church did not know how to categorize. He had arrived in Rome in the spring of 1929, not by invitation, but by a letter of insistence written in gaze, sealed with wax from a monastery that no longer appeared on any map. The letter was addressed not to the Pope, but to the archives themselves. It said simply, "The carrier of the line is arriving." For years, Lemma had worked silently, helping to translate forgotten manuscripts, some of which the Vatican claimed did not exist. He never asked for payment. He never requested housing. Yet every month he deposited pages into the archives, restricted vault, translations from texts the Vatican had never acknowledged, including prophecies from the Book of Enoch and a lost section of the Kebra Nagust. Then in the winter of 1942, during the darkest days of the war, he vanished. No one noticed. For weeks, the world was distracted by bombs and borders. It was a janitor who finally found him in the catacombs beneath the Ethiopian college. He was lying on a stone slab wrapped in a cloak, his hand resting on a bound manuscript that smelled of frankincense and ash. The official report said he died of natural causes. No foul play, no scandal. But what puzzled investigators was not how he died, but why he had left a single phrase carved into the stone beside him, written in a language that Vatican linguists could not translate. Only years later would a young scholar realize the carving was not a phrase. It was a date, a future one. The funeral took place quietly. Only 2 guards escorted the casket to a private crypt marked not with a name but a symbol, a star wrapped in a flame. No priest presided, no incense burned, but just before the casket was lowered, an envelope was placed on top. It held one parchment, a verse in gaze, and beneath it, the Latin translation, "Those who guard in silence are not forgotten. Their funeral is only the world's delay." Heaven already sang. In the farthest corner of the Vatican library, beyond the gilded gates and velvet ropes, past marble corridors worn thin by the feet of popes and pilgrims, there is a room few have seen. Its door bears no label. The key rests in a drawer that most cardinals assume is empty. Inside, the air feels older than dust. It smells like wax and forgotten time. On a stone pedestal under layers of glass and shadow rests a book unlike any other. Its cover is cracked but still firm. The pages stitched by hand with cords of something that looks like sinew shimmer faintly when the candlelight hits them just right. It is not gold leaf, it is something older. Some say the ink was mixed with crushed gemstones and water from a spring that no longer flows. Others believe the words were written by someone who never aged. The script is in GEs, a language older than Latin, older than Greek, and certainly older than any Bible the Church has ever printed. This is the Ethiopian Bible, and it waits. It has waited through wars, through famines, through popes who rose and fell like empires. It has waited through fires that devoured other books, and through whispers of secrets meant to stay buried. No one truly knows when it arrived in the Vatican. Some say it was brought by a dying Jesuit. Others claim it was smuggled in during the Second World War, sewn into the lining of a bishop's cloak. Whatever the truth may be, the Vatican has never displayed it, never acknowledged it, never catalogued it in the official record. Yet it is there. The story goes that the last man to read it aloud lost his voice for 7 days. Another man, a scholar from Germany, fled Rome the day after reading one passage. He was never seen again. A third, a young priest from the Ethiopian college, tried to copy one page by hand. When he finished, the ink disappeared before his eyes. What is it about this Bible that unsettles the highest authorities in the Church? Why does it remain locked away, unread and unspoken? Some believe the answer lies in its structure. The Ethiopian Bible contains more books than the Roman canon. Books of Enoch, of Jubilees, of wisdom long dismissed as legend. In its pages, angels do not whisper, they weep. Prophets do not merely predict, they remember. And Christ in one vision does not return in the clouds, but rises from the heart of Africa, speaking words the Vatican cannot translate. No decree has ordered its destruction, no pope has dared to burn it, and so it waits, for whom no one knows. But in the stillness of that room, some say you can hear the faintest hum like chanting from a place too deep for stone to silence. And Psalm Iwe, perhaps in the dreams of a forgotten monk. The Bible waits for someone brave enough to read it aloud. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If one of these hidden chapters stirred something in you, made you question what lies behind locked doors or forgotten truths, let us know in the comments. We read everyone, and if you haven't yet, Make sure to hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss the next mystery we unfold. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and until next time, sleep well and dream deeper.